Azarok Sector, Beranos System. 744.m32. From its inception at the dawn of the Dark Age of technology, warp travel had been an imprecise art, depending more upon skill, intuition and blind luck than any real science. Calculations helped, but whether that was because the theorems behind them were actually valid or because they imposed some of the order of the materium upon the madness of the warp was still a matter of hot debate between those few who knew Geller's secrets, and none living truly understood them. The barriers between reality and the immaterium were thankfully resilient in most parts of the galaxy, and breaking through them was done through brute force on human vessels. Once the rift into the Sea of Souls had been opened, the ship would pass through, protected from the madness of the Empyrean by its Geller field, and would sail the tides of the warp guided by the sight of its navigator, who would use the ancient secrets of his house combined with the reference beacon of the Astronomicon and maps of existing warp routes drawn by men who rarely died well to bring the ship to its intended destination. For one ship to travel any distance through the warp was a trial upon the minds and souls of all aboard, and even the most skilled navigator could never be certain of delivering her vessel to the desired destination. Such were the dangers of the Empyrean. Such perils were demultiplied when dealing with an entire fleet seeking to journey together to the same destination. The ships may enter the warp in perfect formation, only for half of them to be lost in translation, reappearing years or centuries after the war they had been sent to fight was over. There were means to alleviate these dangers, but they could never be truly avoided altogether. This was known to any captain of the Imperial Navy. And yet, the fleet that entered reality at the Mandeville point of the Beranos system did so with near-perfect synchronicity. A quick count of the ships showed that only 2 of them had been lost to the warp, and the formation in which they had entered the Empyrean had barely been altered by the weeks of travel. It was enough to make most aboard the fleet offer a prayer of thanks to the God Emperor, their faith renewed that they were doing his work today, and that he had bestowed upon them this miracle. And that may very well have been true, but, as ever, the reality was more complex. There was a reason why this fleet's trip had been so successful, one that, should they ever come to learn it, would bring the death of any Imperial soldier aboard. And though the journey to Beranos had been relatively easy, departing from the system would be much more difficult. The ether was boiling with the deaths left in the unbound host's wake, and the navigators of the fleet could all sense that something was being done on Beranos to keep the tides from calming down. Until whatever was causing that phenomenon was dealt with, the Imperial fleet could not hope to leave Beranos in any coherent fashion. In fact, the navigators were quite insistent that they wouldn't lead the fleet back into the warp before the situation at Beranos had been dealt with. After listening to the half-hysterical warnings of the Navis Nobilite mutants, the leaders of the Imperial Armada agreed to destroy the Chaos forces present at Beranos before continuing on their mission to save the Azarok sector from the enemies of mankind. Not that the servants of the Emperor needed any additional reason to crush the heretics, of course. A total of 53 ships translated into the system before the warp rifts closed behind them. It was a mighty host, and yet it was only the first wave of the Imperium's retribution, composed of the forces that had been closest to Azarok when the call for help had been launched. Battlefleet Econta had sent a full battle group to Azarok's aid, and more ships were being gathered within the sector's spaceports. Great troop transports carried entire Imperial regiments within their holds, and the ships of the Imperial Navy sailed alongside those of the Adeptus Astartes and the Inquisition. Ostensibly, 2 chapters of Space Marines had already answered Azarok's call for help, the Red Hunters and the Purple Stars, both chapters of the Second Founding, whose history was shrouded in mystery. Neither of those chapters had their home in the Econta sectors, but their cruisers had joined the fleet at the muster point, and none had dared question the presence of the Emperor's Angels of Death. Most officers already knew that there were Chaos Marines involved in the invasion of Azarok, though that truth, like many others, was concealed from the masses. There were other ships, sailing right amidst the fleet, their names unknown by the Auspex officers. Their identification codes were so highly classified, only a handful of souls across the entire fleet were allowed to know the vessel's allegiance, let alone their name. They were silver and grey, but none could see them, and the Auspexes that scanned them returned only their position, size and mass, to allow navigation around them. The mere knowledge that they were there at all was restricted to the bridge crew. There were 5 such warships, who had joined the Retribution fleet mere hours before the journey to Beranos had begun, forcing the entire formation to be changed to accommodate them, but when the Inquisition had demanded it be so, none had dared to complain. All loyal servants of the God Emperor were welcome, for this Chaos incursion had already defeated the Mitre raid against it at Silberstadt. There were whispers circulating across the fleet comparing it to the Second Black Crusade, less than a century and a half ago, when Abaddon the Despoiler had once more led the denizens of the Eye of Terror against the Imperium. The Archfiend had been defeated, of course, but he had still ravaged the Cadian region before being forced back into the pit from which he had crawled. Despite the best efforts of the commissars to suppress them, there were rumors that this incursion was another Black Crusade, that somehow, the Despoiler had managed to send his forces from the Eye to the Wailing Storm in order to bypass the Cadian Gate entirely. What none knew, was that this was both true and false at once. The flagship of the Imperial fleet was a Victory-class battleship, the Perseus. She sailed at the head of the Imperial Navy contingent, and on her bridge sat Lady Admiral Rebecca del Baranthea, cousin to the Lord Admiral Francesco del Baranthea, who had survived the Battle of Silberstadt and still led the remains of the Imperial Navy in the Azeroth sector. Her face set in stone, the Lady Admiral looked at the first battle that awaited her in Azeroth. The reports of her fleet's auspex flowed through her cortical implants in an uninterrupted data stream, giving her as complete a picture of the situation as was possible. A lesser mind would have been driven insane by the flow of information, but Rebecca had been trained by the best teachers of the del Baranthea family. The fleet of the Unbound Host was gathered in Bereno's orbit, around the demon ship Blade of Terror. Once, the vessel had been called Blade of Terror, and it had fought for the Imperium. But it had died, and been resurrected by the dark arts of the warpsmiths into its present form, a nightmarish amalgamation of flesh and metal, driven by monstrous hungers and just barely kept under the control of the dark mechanicum heretics dwelling within it. If one went purely by numbers, the Chaos Fleet had the advantage. However, the vast majority of the crafts of the Unbound Host were not military vessels but civilian ships repurposed as troop transports or bearing dark mechanicum experimental weaponry to make them marginally useful in combat. There were more than 200 of these vessels, and most of them were empty now, having disgorged millions of troops onto the planet below. More than a few were derelicts, their entire crew having abandoned ship to take part in the war on the surface, leaving critical maintenance undone. If the Lord of the Unbound had ever intended to have his entire host leave Berenos, this would have already put an end to that plan. The Unbound Host had very few ships, 12, including the Blade of Terror, actually designed for battle, and those were a disparate collection captured during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. 3 of them were Dark Mechanicum cruisers from the demonic forged world of Argenta Primus. They had no names, only numbers that were of some mystical significance to the Dark Mechanicum, but the Unbound had taken to calling them the Daggers, as they were slightly smaller than the Blade of Terror, and almost as much infernal in nature as the flagship. They had been detached from Paranefa's armada to escort the forge barge Eidolon of Regret. The monstrous behemoth had been assigned to the Unbound Host in order to keep it supplied with everything that an army of that size needed to make war. The supplies they had gained from the trade with the demon of Muliturgus wouldn't last forever, after all. That forge barge had also been used in transforming Berenos into a stronghold suitable to hold the wrath of the Imperium at bay, and it was far too precious to risk in battle. In fact, according to Alzerak, whose true body being located aboard the Eidolon may or may not be influencing his judgment, it was worth more to the Forsaken Sons than the rest of the Unbound Host combined. Another ship had once belonged to a rogue trader dynasty stretching back to the founding of the Imperium, and whose noble legacy had ended when the ship had been caught in the Wailing Storm. The Unbound Host had found the balance of virtue drifting in a system where every formerly inhabited world was as dead as the vessel. They had captured it, made some repairs, installed a prize crew on it, and kept the name, thinking it humorous. The balance of virtue was cruiser class, but carried armaments far above the norm for a ship of that size. 4 of the remaining ships were frigates, and had been the balance of virtue's escorts when it had been stranded in the Wailing Storm, meeting the same fate as their capital ship. Each had been assigned a pack of Unbound to act as overseers for the crew, which, like for the balance, had been skeletal at first, but had grown to full strength as the Warband found more recruits in the Wailing Storm. At the demand of their captains, the frigate's weaponry had been overhauled, with each vessel being added a powerful lance capable of punching through the shields of any ship of their class. They were called the Voice of Impurity, Fearmonger, Sacraman's Tear and Feral Heart. At some point in the distant past, the Negator and Tiarelian had been Astartes strike cruisers. As far as the Unbound had been able to determine, the vessels had been dragged into the warp sometimes during the heresy, though which legion they had belonged to, if they had belonged to the same at all, had been lost beneath the changes wrought upon the vessels in the Empyrean. They weren't quite demon ships, but their machine spirits had undeniably been corrupted into malign entities that had needed to be appeased with the sacrifices of hundreds before they had submitted to the control of the heretics. Each housed more than 100 Unbound, and they were the best ships of the host when Malone needed his brothers to board an enemy ship. The final ship, Shiva's Wrath, looked nothing like a battleship. In truth, it barely resembled a ship at all, and if any tech priest had suggested its design, he would have been sent away to be converted into a servitor. The Shiva's Wrath was shaped like a ring, with two straight sections making its diameter and crossing into the center at a straight angle, where an array of whirling metal rings surrounded what looked like the bright, captured heart of a star. It was 1 kilometer wide, and it did not have any warp engines of its own. To bring it to Beranos, Malone had had it tethered to 20 lesser crafts that had dragged it into the Empyrean, staying close enough to one another that their Geller fields had overlapped and covered the Shiva's Wrath as well, because, of course, it didn't have its own Geller field generator either. The same ships had dragged it into orbit, for the only motion it could do under its own power was to slowly spin in place. And yet, for all its crippling flaws, it was the most important piece of Malone's plan to prevent the Imperial Armada from simply crushing the Unbound host with their void superiority. Though only one planet of the Beranos system was inhabited, there were other planetoids orbiting the system's star. 4 more worlds turned around the sun, all of them with several mining stations orbiting them, relentlessly extracting resources for Beranos industry. These stations had been the first to feel the wrath of the Unbound host, their crews slaughtered to the last by boarding parties of Unbound while the bulk of the fleet made for the inhabited world, closest to the sun. One of these stations orbited the planet furthest from the star, known simply as Beranos V. The one inhabited world was called Beranos, even though it was the second closest from the sun. It had served as a mining outpost, supporting a community of a few hundreds people whose blood and entrails now covered the broken metal walls. Gravity, heat and air were all gone, the machines that had provided them torn to pieces. Without the gravitic compensators that helped keep the station in geosynchronous orbit above the most abundant mining area, the station's orbit had already begun to deteriorate. The ruins turned around the planet now, slowly, and every rotation brought them closer to the surface. In a few decades, they would get too close, and fall to the planet below, leaving a crater as the sole mark that the station had ever existed. It was there, in this cold and silent tomb, that the unkindness had made its nest. Of all the weapons the Unbound host had found in the Wailing Storm, the unkindness was one of the most disturbing, and perhaps the one that the Imperials would find the most blasphemous, if they ever learned the truth of its nature and origins. At first, they had thought that the system was dead. It wouldn't have been the first time, while the ruinous powers took great amusement in twisting the populated worlds trapped into the Wailing Storm. Their monstrous appetites couldn't always be held in check. So, when the first scans showed no signs of life, the Unbound host believed that this system, which according to the archives had once been a prosperous industry world under the direction of a branch of the Adeptus Mechanicus, had been scoured clean of life by the demonic legions. But there might still have been something of value to find, and so Malone had commanded a deeper exploration. The planet had been ripped apart by the storm, reduced to a loose conglomerate of rocks orbiting a star whose chaos-touched radiation made the surfaces it kissed bubble and whisper the secrets of the dead. Its atmosphere was gone, its biosphere extinguished. Unbound warriors in full, void-sealed armor and magnetic boots had descended to explore the ruins of civilization that still clung to the planet's fragments. They had lost 39 of them when the unkindness had awakened, disturbed by their intrusion. It had taken 7 days before the heretics had been able to make contact with the creatures, 7 days of pitched battle across the broken world, as the Unbound fought to retreat to their landing zones in order to escape. Malone had been able to strike a deal with the creatures, half threatening and half offering in order to make them submit to his authority. After that, they had been able to piece together the origin of these creatures which the Unbound commander had named, after taking a good look at them, the unkindness. As their world fell apart around them, the tech priests had grown desperate. Inspired by visions granted to them by the warp, they had remade themselves and their followers so that they would be able to survive even their planet's death. They had stripped away almost all of their flesh, grafting cybernetics that would allow them to survive even in the void. And, to their credit, it had worked. But when the world had died, the warp had come surging in, and the currents of the Empyrean had remade the cyborgs, twisting them into the unkindness. Their fleshy component had all but died away, and the souls that had clung to existence within them had been snuffed out, replaced by base demonic spirits that were barely self-aware. According to IAMS, these demons had been spawned by the very fear of the void, created by the minds of spacers having nightmares about what awaited them just on the other side of the hull. Perhaps he was right, it didn't matter either way. This was the unkindness, and for the bargain Malone had struck, the Lord of the Unbound was bound to feed them, and assist them in replenishing their numbers. Of course, he had found a way to make that last responsibility work in his favor by making sure it reinforced his control over them. The being who called itself the Alpha had once been an Unbound, and before that, a child living in fear of the beasts that stalked the dark, which itself had been the world Mula Secundus before the coming of the Wailing Storm. But time, and the whims of chaos, transformed all things, and now, it was the prime of the unkindness, leader of that flock of monstrous demonic cyborgs. Slowly, it woke from its cold slumber. A voice was whispering into its ears, demanding that it rise, that it perform the function for which it had been remade. It knew that voice of old, though it had forgotten how exactly. It remembered that the voice should be obeyed, for it promised blood and meat in exchange for following its orders. "We hear you," it replied, its words carried across the airless void. It was difficult to speak, to think using human words instead of the simpler, clearer language of the pack. Every time it had to, it took it longer to remember how to do it. Part of it knew that eventually, it would lose the ability completely, but only a smaller part of it cared. Such was the glory of flying in the void that the loss of what remained of its humanity seemed a small price to pay. In fact, the greater part of it awaited the complete loss of these last remains with impatience. Speaking made it remember, and it hated that. It made it remember that, once, it had been a he. And it remembered that he had been hurt, badly. It remembered flying on wings of fire, and the raw exuberance of fulfilling the purpose for which he had been designed, as an unbound gene bred for three-dimensional combat. Then, it remembered the smell of rotting flesh, the sensation of his heart's hammering in his chest, the screams of a monster heard through mundane senses, and it remembered fangs too, so sharp and so huge, cold as ice as they bit into him. He had died then, but the voice had brought it back. It was a wraith, a ghostly echo possessing the remnants of his body, machine-bound to one of the unkindness. It was the Alpha. Violence and death clad in cold metal and driven by inhuman will, unbound by any restraint, any mercy. The Alpha screamed silently across a frequency that only its brethren could hear, sending disturbances across the ether that would reach distant worlds in thousands of years and cause their inhabitants to wake from sleep, seized by a nameless dread. It was a call to awaken, using brutal imagery and drawing upon instincts inscribed into the darkling minds of the unkindness. It had no words, but if a mortal soul had been able to comprehend it, it might have translated it thusly: "The unkindness goes to hunt." Alarms began to ring across the bridges of every Imperial vessel as an unidentified threat emerged from the ruined mining station. Where before there had been nothing but cold metal, now there was a flurry of activity, as hundreds and then thousands of signals suddenly became visible on the Auspex. Each signal was the size of a space fighter, though one of the larger models, but they didn't move like any such engine known to the Imperium. This new force struck the Imperial Armada from the side, slipping under void shields and ripping the outer layer of the hulls apart with their claws. The point defenses of the vessels opened fire in response, but the creatures moved in the void with preternatural agility and dodged almost every shot from stationary defenses. In response, Lady Admiral Del Barenthia ordered her fleet to unleash their own fighter squadrons, and the void above Beranos V was lit by the battle between the unkindness and a veritable army of the Imperial Navy's best and brightest. Among them was first-class pilot Howard Johnson, assigned to the 727th Imperial Navy Fighter Wing, deployed aboard the Perseus as part of the liberation effort in the Azarok sector. He and the rest of his wing had been waiting aboard their crafts, ready for launch, since the flagship had emerged from the warp. They hadn't known what the situation in Beranos was, and though the sheer size of space made being ambushed right after translating out of the warp almost impossible, it had been known to happen, especially where the foul sorcery of the heretics was involved. Then, they had been sent data from the bridge, showing them the disposition of enemy forces, the local conditions and phenomena, and everything else they might need to know once they were unleashed. The data collected by the Auspex streamed across his screen, and he frowned. These specs, compiled from what the enemy crafts had been observed doing, made no sense. He knew of nothing that could move with such maneuverability at such speeds and at that size. He would trust his Fury-class interceptor over any devilish invention of the arch-enemy any day, of course. The Red Claw was a beautiful, beautiful thing, 60 meters of shining metal and reinforced plexiglass panels, with banks of forward-facing las cannons and missile launchers. At her helm, he had taken part in over 40 engagements, battling pirates and Xenos raiders all over the segmentum in the 12 years since he had graduated from the Navy's Academy and been assigned to the 727th in the Perseus. In all that time, he hadn't met any heretic craft that could match her. But still, this was going to be an interesting fight for sure. The orders came through the Vox, in the terse, clear voice of the flight's monitor from the flagship's bridge. One by one, the rest of his flight called off, signaling their readiness. Redclaw, he heard his navigator call out behind him when their turn came, ready to go. Squadron readiness acknowledged. Begin takeoff. For the Emperor and the Navy. For the Emperor. They all dutifully chorused back. One by one, the squadron left from the hangar, flying outside at speeds far above what was recommended for takeoff, but which were necessary with enemies so close to the ship. Indeed, no sooner had the craft passed outside of the vessel's shield envelope that they were right in the middle of as tense and chaotic a fight as any he had ever taken part in. The rush of G-forces slammed Howard against his padded seat. If not for the spinal injector jacked into his body, feeding him a cocktail of stimulants along with hyperoxygenated blood to sharpen his reflexes, the shock would have made him pass out. As it was, he still felt the same acute and familiar discomfort and pain, which he ignored with practiced ease. He had more pressing concerns, much more pressing ones, in fact. There were Auspex returns from everywhere around them. Hundreds of fighters had been unleashed by the Imperial fleet, and the enemy, whatever it was, matched their numbers. Point defenses were firing, unleashing short range, at least for a void battle. The shots easily reached several kilometers away. Weaponry. His navigator, Oleg, called out to him in warning. Bogey on our tail, quadrant 953. I see it, replied Howard, glancing at the Auspex before leaning into the commands and plunging Redclaw into a nosedive, relatively to the Perseus plane. They danced through the void, Howard focusing his entire being on keeping his distance with their pursuer, while Oleg tried to get the assistance of another craft, and Nikos, their gunner, took every shot that presented itself. It was at times like this that Howard wished that the Fury class came with some rotating weaponry, in order to deal with enemies that were in pursuit. But that wasn't Imperial Navy doctrine. Either the enemy was in front of them, or they were in the thick of it and could rely on their comrades. He was fairly sure this was to discourage cowardice, though how a gunship with limited fuel was supposed to flee in the cold void of space, he had no idea. But it was best not to discuss such things aloud, in case the commissars heard. Their pursuer was closing in on them, using its superior maneuverability to keep up with every maneuver Howard was using to throw it off. He was confident Redclaw had more powerful engines, but in the chaos of the battle, going in a straight line to accelerate in full was simply suicidal. It was guaranteed someone would lock onto their path and blow them apart. Thrice another Imperial craft tried to kill their pursuer, and thrice it dodged their blows. Finally, after making a run close to the defense batteries of the Space Marine frigate Daramon's Blade, Howard finally managed to break free, thanks to the cover provided by the ship's defenses forcing their enemy to break off their pursuit. It was right then, as Oleg scanned the battlefield for a target or someone else in need of assistance, that the creature slammed into them. It loomed over Howard, obscuring the entire plexiglass panel. It was the first time Howard actually saw what the enemy looked like in the battle. During the entire hunt, not only had their pursuers been behind them, but the distances involved in even such a comparatively close quarters engagement as this were still measured in hundreds of kilometers. They had been had, Howard realized, some part of him still analyzing the tactical situation while the rest of him recoiled in terror at the sight. The bogey they had tried to escape had been a lure, a distraction set on their tail so that this one could catch them by surprise at the peak of the hunt. But to think that something like this was capable of an ambush, Howard had seen servitors wired into the machinery of fighter crafts before. Of course, the Imperial Navy made extensive use of them. He had even flown alongside engines belonging to the Adeptus Mechanicus, where the pilots were half men bound to their crafts, never to leave them until they died. It had always made him uncomfortable, knowing that this could very well end up being his fate if he were to be gravely injured without being lucky enough to actually die. In the void, such a doom was rare, but you never knew. And yet, this was something else. He could see the body at the heart of the abomination, a shriven, desiccated thing, its skin blackened by void exposure and cosmic radiation. It should be dead, but its eyes glared at him with utterly inhuman hate, telling him that, against all sense and reason, some spark of life remained within that husk. Little more than a head and torso remained, the latter pierced by so many vicious-looking implants that barely any of it was visible. Neurocables and tubes emerged from the stumps of its limbs, linked to machinery that made no sense to him. It was technology, but it looked alive, somehow. 4 articulated wings emerged behind the creature, each affixed with a propulsive unit, and 4 pairs of insect-like limbs stretched from its core, each ending with a razor-sharp claw. The ranged weapons were cannons at the shoulders of the cyborg's flesh component. All of it radiated malevolence, like a terrible cross between a madman's vision of an angel and a mechanized butterfly from hell. And yet, it was the eyes that scared Howard the most. They were made of flesh, the white almost completely filled by black veins, and they stared at him as if he were nothing at all, only prey to be devoured, meat to fuel the unholy hunger of this abomination. He wondered, amidst the terror and adrenaline, just how the creature's eyes, easily the organ most susceptible to be destroyed by the slightest exposure to space, were still functioning. It was the last thought that passed through the mind of Howard Johnson before the claws of the monster pierced through the cockpit and reached him, plucking him from his seat, tearing his restraining belts and pulling out his spinal implant with a spike of cold agony. After that, there was only blind, mindless panic and pain, which ended mercifully quickly. Without its pilot, Red Claw was left drifting, at the inexisting mercy of the other monsters dancing in the void. The navigator was the last of the crew to die, 73 seconds after Howard, all of which were filled with fear. From the bridge of the Blade of Terror, Morkoth watched as the engines of several Imperial ships were disabled in the unkindness initial onslaught, forcing the entire fleet to come to a halt until this threat was dealt with, lest the squadrons be cut off from their home bases. The Unbound smiled, revealing pointed teeth the same obsidian as his eyeballs, and turned to a Vox officer. "Signal the Unkindness to withdraw from the engagement, then tell the Shiva's Wrath to open fire." The Shiva's Wrath did not have a bridge, or, if it had one, the Forsaken Sons hadn't been able to recognize it when they had claimed the wreck. In a way, considering it would take it years to simply move through a star system, it could be argued that the Shiva's Wrath was not actually a ship at all. It was a nightmare of slapdash engineering and improvised repairs, held together by the endless work of thousands of servitors and hundreds of skilled heretics. What passed for its command center was located in its outer rings, where the Forsaken Sons had boarded it first. It was from there that Julius, the Unbound who had been given the dubious honor of command over the Shiva's Wrath, directed the constant struggle of those under him to keep it in working condition. Like most Unbound, Julius' physiology deviated from the standard Astartes template. The Flesh Masters loved to experiment, and Julius was another of Jacaerus' successes, though it had taken some time before Malone had found how best to use him. Julius was one of the younger Unbound, found, tested and transformed during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. He had been taken from one of the most dangerous worlds ever encountered by the Warband, a planet racked by constant disasters both natural and unnatural. There, shelter was only ever temporary, and constant vigilance the only way to survive. The children who had been harvested from that place, an act that had almost certainly doomed the struggling human population to extinction, all had exceptional situational awareness, their senses sharpened by having lived their entire lives under the constant threat of immediate death. Jacaerus had taken Julius as one of the most promising aspirants, and through tweaking his conditioning and gene forging, the Flesh Master had made him into what he was now. Julius had displayed a surprising knack for technology, despite his people having been sent back to the Stone Age long ago. A few weeks of hypno-teaching had made him as knowledgeable as any tech marine, Though he had lacked the corresponding experience and had had to gain that the hard way, his survival instincts the only thing keeping him alive as he underwent a training regimen that would have made even the sternest Martian taskmaster pause with worry. Right now, surrounded by a mess of cables and consoles showing the states of various devices throughout the vessel, he was calling upon all of that training. Morkoth's order had arrived 12 seconds ago, transmitted by a very nervous-sounding mortal officer, and they were entering the final stage of the firing sequence. The process had actually begun hours ago, when the Imperial fleet had begun translating in system. Beneath the cables and the cogitators, the original alien structure was still visible. It looked like ordinary stone, but was actually a compound stronger than ceramite, capable of withstanding the pressures put on it by the firing of the Shiva's wrath. Which, of course, begged the question of just what had broken it in several sections of the vessel, requiring the Forsaken Sun's repairs. There were many theories circulating among the Dark Mechanicum contingent, but as far as Julius knew, no one had found any evidence supporting any of them. Results of the last check coming in. We are in alignment, announced Klekar, one of the other unbound aboard. Deviation 0.027%, within the acceptable margin of error. Accumulators charged at 95%, droned one of the many servitors. Initiating countdown, 97%, 98%, 99%, accumulators charged. Core receivers report full readiness, called out one of the heretics. Brace for firing, said Julius, turning to where they had installed the big, red button that would actually unleash the awesome might of the Shiva's wrath. He still wasn't sure why they had made it look like that. It had been after several months of long, complex, mind-bendingly frustrating work trying to make sense of the alien architecture and technology of the vessel, and they had all been going a little bit crazy by that point. He had to admit, though, that he certainly enjoyed that part. Julius keyed in the code to remove the plexiglass cover, while everyone around him, still able to think for themselves, clung to the railings and prepared themselves. He heard more than a few quick prayers to the dark gods and the eightfold Omnissiah for protection. Julius didn't say one himself. He had seen the faces of the gods in the wailing storm, in a city of ensorcelled mirrors crafted by a civilization of blind mutants. Rather than find religion, he had emerged from the vision more determined than ever to bind the warp to his will through the machine. Submission of any kind to the divine was difficult when you knew the truth appearance of the gods, and when you had something like the Shiva's wrath under his command. Firing! He shouted, bringing his gauntleted fist onto the activation rune. The power accumulators suddenly discharged, unleashing their stored energy toward the center of the ringed ship through the tank-sized focusing crystals jutting out of the vessel's inner side. The flows of power were channeled by the Xenotech devices installed through the length of the engine's inner cross-section, and struck the waiting receivers at the central hub. Hundreds of servitors, each performing a function vital to the Shiva's wrath firing, were either obliterated or bathed in enough radiation to melt their augmetics and turn their flesh to charred husks. The entire vessel shook, breaches forming as sections of the hull tore under the strain. On the bridge, the sound of alarms was almost, but not quite, loud enough to drown that of disaster. Two servitors connected to working stations burst into flames and a tech priest started screaming in the tongue of the ship's dead makers before an unbound put a bolt into his skull and silenced him. All in all, thought Julius, this was going much better than the last and only other time they had fired the ship's ridiculous gun. For a start, there weren't any demons manifesting on the bridge to kill them all, though that may be due to the fact they were outside the wailing storm rather than to the warding signs that had been burned in the walls with plasma torches. And, according to the readout on his helm display, the radiation shielding on the command center was holding, which meant they wouldn't need to replace the less augmented personnel when their biological parts got fried. Yes, much better than last time. It was a shame that this was, in all likelihood, the last time that Shiva's wrath fired. It would take weeks to repair all the damage and replace the destroyed servitors, and with the war going on, the Warband wouldn't have the resources to spare. But that was a problem for later. Right now, with the most urgent tasks done or delegated, Julius could watch the fruits of his work on the screen, and enjoy the show. 3.51387 seconds after Julius had pressed the rune, the single weapon of the Shiva's wrath fired. A single beam of incandescent white energy burst out of the vessel's center at a perpendicular angle. It was so bright that, on the surface of Beranos itself, humans who had the misfortune of looking up at that moment recoiled in pain, clawing at their faces as their eyes were blinded by the illumination, as if they had stared right into the sun by accident. It took several minutes for the beam, moving at the speed of light, to reach its target. The Imperial fleet had no warming. By the time their instruments detected the attack and linked it to the power surge they had detected earlier in the bizarre engine of the traitors, it had already hit. After a delay exactly as long as the time it took for the beam to hit, Julius saw what happened then. The frozen mining world which loomed to the right of the fleet core ward simply shattered. Julius had aimed his one shot well. He had hit Beranos V at just the right angle and location to send the bulk of the fractured mass directly into the Imperial fleet, still recovering its fighters after the sudden retreat of the unholy tech constructs that had attacked them. Shields buckled against the impacts, with several frigates being overwhelmed and broken apart by the speeding rocks. Reactors' outputs had to be adjusted as the gravitic field was suddenly changed. Even the ships that were untouched by the speeding meteors drifted out of position as their tech priests and pilots tried to correct their course to take the new conditions into account. Aboard the Perseus, Lady Admiral Del Baranthia reacted instantly to this new threat, refusing to let her shock at the traitor's incredible weapon make her fail in her duty. She called for the smaller ships of the fleet to seek shelter near the battleship, whose guns could reduce the biggest asteroids to dust before they hit. Across the Imperial fleet, commissars restored orders on bridge racked by panic as the crew realized what the enemy had done, and the scope of the Mitre raid against them sunk in. The execution of a few officers for cowardice brought back order, and the ships began to obey their Lady Admiral's command, seeking safety by combining their firepower and void shields. At the same time, aboard the Blade of Terror, Morkoth saw the results of his orders to Julius, and laughed, before ordering the 11 ships of his small fleet to advance and get into formation. The Shiva's wrath could not move. It would be days before the radiation levels of its corridors had lowered enough that the work of cleaning up the dead servitors and repairing the damage could begin. Across the Chaos vessels, the Unbound roared their joy at the Fleet Master's command, knowing that the time had come for them to do battle once more. The Unkindness soared back into the fray, maneuvering the asteroid field with ease, their brutish demon spirits reminded of their ruined home. The crews of the flight wings were hurtled back out into the void, into a battlefield that was now even more dangerous than before. But even as the fleet reeled from the blow, even as Lady Admiral Del Baranthia tried to restore formation and face the advancing Chaos fleet, a single ship broke free from the newly created asteroid field. It was one of the 5 ships that were invisible to their allies, and it surged ahead, aimed straight at Beranos Prime, like a silver arrow striking through the black void. Aboard it were warriors who were celebrated in neither song nor statues, for whom the destruction of Beranos V was a minor concern compared to what they knew was unfolding on the system's inhabited world. On the surface of Beranos, within the innermost chambers of the Black Temple, the creature known as Cherub looked up, briefly, staring at something beyond the blood-caked walls of the horror-filled structure it had made. It smiled. "Come," it whispered, in a voice that caused the latest sacrificial victim strung on the altar before it to moan in terror through the dirty rag pressed on his mouth. "Come to me, little knights. Such games I have prepared for you, Azeroth Sector, Beranos System. 744.m32. From the skies they came, on wings of fire and lightning, clad in holiness and carrying death in their hands and hatred in their hearts. And lo, before them the unholy did weep and cry out, as the Emperor's own wrath descended upon them." From the 967th canticle of the Aphelion Creed. A pale, translucent figure walked across the wastes of Beranos, leaving no trace on the mix of sand and dust that stretched between the hive cities. It moaned in pain as it walked, haunted by the echoes of its death. The wraith did not recall its name. In truth, it remembered very little, and what pieces of its memory remained served only to torment it further. It remembered walking, in the heat and the abrasive wind, with the lash slapping at its back to keep it going. It remembered fear, and hunger, and thirst. And, beyond those memories, it remembered that there had been a time before that torment, a time when it had not suffered, a time when it had still had a name. The ghost reached the end of its walk, and vanished, reappearing a kilometer back, where it began its walk all over again. It was trapped there, this remnant of a man who had once been a merchant in one of Beranos' cities, before the coming of the Unbound host. Condemned to repeat his final moments, over and over, a little more of his essence stripped away at each agonizing cycle, until there was nothing left. It did not know this, of course. All it knew was that it had to keep walking. When the cycle began anew, it was all it remembered. Only after a few hundred, pain-filled meters did the Wraith began to remember anything else. And, every cycle, it took longer for the memories to return. Halfway through the walk, as the first memories of hunger began to emerge, particles of light appeared around the Wraith. It did not pause, for it could not notice anything that differed from its final moments. It was why it had kept walking through the days and the nights since its death. The particles coalesced into arcs of lightning, and the air was filled with the scent of ozone. The air thrummed with increasing levels of energy, until it reached a peak and reality was torn apart in a flash of blinding light that turned the dust to glass in a 30 meters radius. Within that light were 5 towering silhouettes, and the blazing light of their spirits was the last thing the Wraith perceived before it was caught in the raging empiric energies and, with one last pained cry, obliterated. The Grey Knights emerged from the teleportation at full battle readiness, their nemesis weapons drawn and powered up. There were 5 of them, sent from the holds of the ship that had broken off the main Imperial fleet and was now anchored in orbit, hidden from detection by a variety of cloaking devices. Their power armor gleamed in the faded light of Berano's star as it passed through the thick clouds of dust and pollution that covered much of the ruined hive world. Upon the hallowed suits of warplate were engraved hexagrammatic seals of purity and protection, along with sacred oaths of devotion and hatred and thrice-blessed purity seals, which had been applied days before when the warriors had made their final preparations for the war to come. As the last sparks of the energy storm unleashed by their teleportation faded, the air around them continued to shimmer, as the ambient corruption in the planet's very atmosphere reacted to their presence. Each warrior was anathema to the things that dwelled in the warp, a champion raised from the dregs of humanity. Only 5 warriors, and yet, the cost of their war gear's creation alone would break the economies of many imperial worlds. Together, they were a force that could bring down the schemes of the ruinous powers and cast their infernal minions back into the depths of the Empyrean that had spawned them. Indeed, they had done so many times before, in the years since they had been taken from the holds of the black ships and reforged into living weapons. Whoever they had been before the chapter had dragged them out of the muck was lost, gone entirely behind years of mind-scrubbing and hypno-conditioning. Any weakness they might have inherited from their mortal origins had been removed and replaced with the strength of the Emperor's gift and the surety of their purpose. With their eyes and minds, they scanned their surroundings. Once they were satisfied that there was no immediate threat, they set off, walking in perfect synchronicity, covering each other's back and keeping their weapons powered up. They may not have sensed any imminent danger, but that only meant any danger that was present was subtle enough to elude them, and therefore dangerous in the extreme. To the north, their destination could be seen behind the dunes. A black pyramid rose from the waste some 10 kilometers away, its surface crackling with arcs of purple lightning that jumped between the unholy, blood-red chaos runes that were engraved into the construction. Each dark symbol was more than 2 meters high, and the keen eyes of the Grey Knights, enhanced further by their helmet's display, could see that there were hundreds of them on the smooth outside of the pyramid, from its base to its peak, exactly 888 meters above the ground. Taken as a whole, the runes formed a complex malefic incantation, the UN words of a dark ritual that channeled the energies of the pyramid into the ether, staining it with chaotic corruption. To the psychic senses of the Grey Knights, the stain was all the more visible. Its vile corruption radiated like a baleful beacon, pulsating like an arrhythmic heartbeat in response to the unholy acts being performed within the pyramid. Demonic spirits circled above the pyramid, half-formed nightmares drawn into being by these terrible things. Whether by arrogance or design, the foul traitors who had despoiled Beranos had done little to hide the source of the threat. From the teleportarium chamber aboard the vessel promised deliverance, the Grey Knights had teleported as close to the source of the disruption as possible. Now, they had to cross the final distance on foot, and put an end to this festering evil. "There are bodies beneath the sand," called out one of the knights on a heavily encrypted vox link. "Their terror and pain permeates this accursed land." The warrior's armor bore the marking of a Justica, for he was the leader of this squad. In his hands, he held a shining nemesis sword. On one of his armor's pauldron, like on his brothers, was the emblem of their chapter's second brotherhood, the Blades of Victory. The other pauldron bore his personal heraldry, which marked him to all other Grey Knights as Asterius Denius. Unlike other chapters, the Grey Knights did not write their names anywhere upon their person, lest that knowledge be taken by their enemies and used against them. Their brothers knew who they were, and that was more than enough. Glory meant nothing to one such as them.
"You are right,
Brother Justica," answered another of the warriors.
With the haft of his nemesis halberd, he stirred the ground at his feet, revealing bleached bone.
Like all Grey Knights,
Pallas was a psyker, and could sense what Asterius had detected. So many had perished here, in so similar fashions, that their last moments had left a powerful psychic imprint upon the land.
But look deeper,
the dead line up in the same direction, toward this blasphemous construction.
These must be the sacrifices who were dragged here and didn't survive the last length of the journey. If the enemy was willing to let so many perish before even reaching their destination, pointed out Perses, who also held a halberd, then there must have been many more who survived long enough. Or perhaps even those deaths were part of their heretical designs.
Then it is even more important that we prevent their foul plans from succeeding, cut in Asterius. On the move, brothers. Our duty awaits us. The strike squad advanced at a brisk pace, not quite running but still fast enough that a mortal man would have struggled to keep up on a flat surface, let alone in the shifting sands. They followed the trail left in the sand by those who had came before. "If our enemy needed prisoners, then why bring them here on foot?" asked Menicius, who had been silent so far. Of the 5, he alone held a massive demon hammer, engraved with symbols of exorcism and anathema to the Neverborn. This desert spreads for hundreds of kilometers. The conditions must have killed half of the captives sent from the rest of the planet at least. "A combination of ritualism and practicality, I suspect," replied Asterius. "The survivors would be exhausted and traumatized by the time they arrive. Besides, only specialized vehicles would be able to thread this region, and those must have been requisitioned by the invaders for their own use." Menicius grunted. The Justica could feel his brother's simmering anger at the callousness of Barano's invaders. He shared this anger, but Menicius' emotions had always been somewhat more intense than those of the rest of his squad. It was the source of his strength, but it was also why he hadn't been made Justica, despite being a better warrior than Asterius. It wasn't to the point that his emotions would influence his judgment. Of course, he would never have been made a Grey Knight if it were the case. But the Grand Master had judged that his passion would serve the chapter best as a champion, and Menicius was happy with that. The Grey Knights arrived at their target less than 15 minutes later. Up close, they could make more details of the Black Pyramid. The stones of the temple could only have been laid down a few weeks ago, unless their intelligence on Barano's situation was incredibly wrong. And yet, the structure already looked like a millennia-old ruin. The angles of the stones were eroded to smooth curves, and there were cracks in the foundations. Asterius called this to the attention of his brothers. "The foul rituals taking place within are eroding the fabric of reality," said Pallas. "Time is breaking apart as the materium wears down. This is not a good sign." "We have arrived not a moment too soon then," noted Japheth. "They made no effort to conceal their activities here," said Perses, the last of the strike squad. It had been him who had been sent to assist in coordinating with the other Imperial forces deployed in the system, though he had done so through intermediaries. Even the situation in the Azeroth sector did not override the Grey Knights' secrecy protocols. But with the forces of Chaos having come to Azeroth in strength not seen outside the Despoiler Zone Black Crusade, the Second Brotherhood needed to have a voice at the war councils. Every psyker worth the name in the fleet felt the currents of the Empyrean gathering here. If we had not come, another chapter would have sent forces to attempt to stop it instead. Inquisitor Galarine had to intervene to prevent the Red Hunters from dispatching one of their cruisers ahead of the rest of the fleet. What did she tell them? Though the Red Hunters are closely tied to the Ordosh, only their chapter master is allowed to know about us. She simply told them that she had this matter in hands, Menicius. Our cousins knew better than to ask questions. Besides, they will have more than enough foes to face in the void. Then we shall make sure that the good Inquisitor's word isn't broken. Prepare yourselves. The path leading to the entrance was lined with stone statues, standing on pedestals of the same materials. There were more bodies piled up against the pedestals, in various states of rot. Judging by their position and the damage they had suffered post-mortem, broken limbs and dashed skulls, the corpses had been thrown away to free the path to the entrance with more than human strength. The passage into the heretical temple had too many angles, and their degrees didn't add up in any fashion conform to three-dimensional geometry. As the Grey Knights walked between the statues, Asterius raised hand, and they stopped. A hot wind began to blow,
carrying a scent of blood that found its way past the filters of the Grey Knights' helmets before crashing against the walls of their psyches. It brought with it a voice, first a distant whisper, which grew in volume until it sounded as if the speaker were right among them. It was a rotten, vile sound, full of mockery and arrogance.
"Ah, our guests have finally arrived. Very well. Let the festivities begin."
The statues on both sides of the squad suddenly exploded, the stones shattering to reveal the infernal creatures that had been concealed within. Screaming from things that only resembled mouths, 24 monstrosities charged the Grey Knights, only to be met by the blessed metal of Nemesis weapons.
"Smite the unclean, brothers!" bellowed Asterius as he faced the first demon to reach him.
"We are the tip of his spear. We are the edge of his sword," his brothers roared back in answer. His sword blazed bright with azure light as he struck his first blow on Beranos. The Nemesis blade cut through the raised limbs of an amalgamation of stone and bloody bones before burying itself deep into its skull. Asterius pulled the sword free just in time to block another assault, this one coming from a thing of black, oily tentacles and lamprey mouths. The power field surrounding the weapon sizzled as the unholy limbs clung around it and burned. The storm bolt mounted on his left wrist roared, and the demon burst apart as the holy ammunition penetrated its skin and detonated inside of its grotesque body. Another hellspawn hurled itself at Asterius, and he battered it aside before plunging his sword into what passed for its head. Next to him, Monetius' demon hammer crackled with energy as it smashed into something with a white, featureless face and a body made of rusted knives. Asterius turned his gaze just in time to see Pallas put a bolt shell through the multi-faced head of a chimeric creature with glistening chitin and furry, clawed limbs. Next to his brother, Japheth and Perses were putting down their own adversaries, a near-identical pair of demons with blue shells and spikes the color of bleached bone. And then it was over. All of the demons were gone, banished back into the Empyrean. The wounds dealt unto them by the Grey Knights' weaponry ensured that it would be centuries, if ever, before any of them reformed and found a way back to the Materium. The only damage they had sustained was a single blow Japheth had taken to his shoulder pauldron, where the claw of something with black feathers and beaks made of pearl had scratched the paint. "Did the master of this place truly expect to take us by surprise?" asked Monetius, pulling his hammer free of the rapidly dissolving remains of his last kill. He sounded almost disappointed.
"I doubt it," replied Perses.
It reeks of a test.
And that troubles me."
That voice seemed to imply that we were expected.
"Of course we were. You said it yourself. The heretics didn't even try to hide what they are doing here.
They must have known someone would be sent to stop them."
"Yes, but there was something about the tone. It's like they were expecting us."
There was a moment of silence. There was no need for anyone to say out loud that this should not be possible, that the Grey Knights' very existence was meant to be concealed from the archenemy.
"Whether they were or not," said Asterius, "it does not change our duty. On me, brothers. We are going in." The instant Asterius crossed the threshold, he nearly stumbled.
Suddenly, his mind was assailed by a cacophony of screams, hundreds, thousands of voices screaming in pain and terror.
The wards engraved on his armor briefly flared, reinforcing his mental defenses, and the pressure eased, though the screams did not fade away entirely. They remained clear enough for Asterius to recognize them. As his brothers followed him past the threshold and adapted to the pressure in turn, it was Japheth who gave voice to that realization. These aren't the screeches of demons. These are human screams. The prisoners, Asterius realized. We suspected they were brought here as sacrifices. This unholy temple is a psychic battery of sort, accumulating the sorcerous energy generated by their deaths. That's why we couldn't hear the screams outside the wards surrounding this place. "Then we shall avenge them," declared Monetius, taking point, his demon hammer in hands. The being that dwelled at the bottom of the bone pit called himself Ixvocar. Once, what seemed like an eternity ago, he had been human. He didn't like to think back on that time. It disgusted him to think that he could ever have been so weak, so limited. He had discarded all ties to that existence when he had become one of the Ix, renouncing his humanity so that he may do more than merely survive. On Warband, the Ix had been predators without equals. They had ruled the planet, enforcing their will upon a cowed human population by making examples of all those who dared defy them. In ages past, when the heavens had burned and the world had been cut off from the rest of the galaxy, the Ix had risen,
destroying the human civilization and building their own feudal kingdoms upon the ruins. Ixvocar hadn't been alive to see it. He hadn't been there when the skies had turned black and red, and the pit of fire and flesh had opened on Nabren to deliver immortality to those who were worthy of its dark blessings. No, he had been born under the rule of the Ix, and chosen to join their ranks when he had proven his worth to the one who had owned him, body and soul. She had taken him to the pit of fire and flesh, and there, he had been stripped of everything he had been and made anew. He had been grateful to her, grateful enough that, when he had made his move to overthrow her and claim her territory as his own, he had given her the mercy of a quick demise. For centuries after that, he had ruled his domain, selecting others to be taken to the pit so that they could serve him, always wary of another trying to do unto him as he had done unto his maker. He had risen through the hierarchy of the Ix, though even he had always been beholden to the ancients, the mysterious council of the Ix that ruled all of Nabren through their agents and puppets. He had cultivated his power and abilities, fighting against both rivals, would-be usurpers, and the occasional demonic incursion. Despite the edicts of the ancients, there had always been those foolish enough to believe that demons could help them ascend beyond their station. They had always been devoured by the very things they called forth, though there had been rumors that this was because the ancients themselves made sure to sabotage all attempts in a bid to prevent any from challenging their rule through demonic assistance. Regardless of the truth, for Ixvocar, it had been a time of prosperity and power. That time had ended when the heavens had burned with the fires of descending drop pods. The Unbound had shattered the delicate balance of power, casting down the Ix carefully cultivated empires. Their mortal armies had been slaughtered with effortless ease, and though the progeny of the Ix-Lords had fared better once herded against the invaders, they too of you had been defeated eventually. By the time the Ix-Lords had been re-signed to fighting themselves, it was too late. In a single night of bloodshed, the invaders' lord had conquered Nabren's capital, slain half of the ancients, and seized the pit of fire and flesh. With the source of the Ix power in his hands, the one who was called Malone had been able to dictate his terms to the entire planet. The Ix-Lords had gathered in their ruined capital, and made to swear fealty to the Unbound Lord. Each and every one of them had been marked with sorceress brands heated in the pit's own flames, enforcing their compliance, though, as in all things, there were ways around these restraints. A handful of Ix-Lords and a single ancient had been left behind to rule Nabrend in the name of the Unbound Host, while the rest joined their conqueror's army. The pit itself had been taken from Nabrend, its power extracted from the planet by the sorcerer Iams and the other witches in the Unbound Lord's service. They had fought alongside their new masters to help in the conquest of other worlds within the Wailing Storm, until the call had come for all of the Forsaken Sons together. Ixvocar remembered the terror he had felt when he had witnessed the full might of the host that had answered the call. Until then, he had believed the Unbound Host to be unstoppable, but the sight of so many ships and armies gathered in one place had shown him the full scope of his master's power quite decisively. They had no choice but to obey, now more than ever. In one of the systems where the Unbound Host had stopped on its way to Beranos, Malone had thrown the pit of fire and flesh into the system's sun, causing a massive demonic incursion that had scourged the system's 5 inhabited, well-defended worlds. For 12 days, the Chaos Fleet had remained at the edge of the system, fighting skirmishes with picket fleets and laying waste to the outermost stations. Then a stealth ship of the Dark Mechanicum with a sacrificial crew had reached the sun, and thrown its deadly cargo inside it. Malone had ordered the fleet back into the warp as soon as the Psychers had started to scream, but even so, they had lost over a dozen transports in their flight from the doomed system. When the truth of the pit's sacrifice had been discovered, half of the remaining Ix had revolted. As it turned out, Malone had been prepared for that eventuality. The rebels had been slaughtered before their insurrection even began, and the remaining ones had only survived by attaching themselves to Jerib. But they had not forgotten what the Lord of the Unbound had done. Without the pit, the Ix couldn't create more of their kind. Worse, they had started to age again, for their immortality had been tied to the pit's mysterious origins. But Jerib had promised them salvation. When the Ascended's great work was complete, a new pit would be delivered onto the Ix, who would rise higher than ever before. Neither Ixvocar nor any of his kindred trusted the Ascended, but they had little choice left. They had followed Jerib to Beranos, helped it build the Black Temple using their superhuman strength. Then, as the blood of the sacrifices flowed and their flesh burned in the sacred fires, Jerib had bade the remaining Ix to burrow into the bone pits, and wait there for the enemies that would come.
They had borne this supreme indignity, knowing that to defy Jerib was to abandon their last chance at preserving their immortality. And now, laying down at the bottom of the pits, Ixvocar could feel the intruders above. Distant though it was, their presence burned at him, filled him with rage. They had no place here, in this sacred place where the future of the Ix was to be reforged. He began to move, feeling all of the other Ix-lords do the same around him. Though only a fraction of their number remained from the time they had ruled over the world of their birth, they still vastly outnumbered the intruders. As he rose through the bones, his body twisting into its war shape, Ixvocar felt a cold satisfaction flow through him. Soon, he would have the chance to unleash all of his pent-up frustration at these foolish intruders. After all, whoever they were, they couldn't be as dangerous as the Forsaken Sons. This time, the attack almost took the Grey Knights by surprise. The first room they had found, at the end of a long corridor, was filled with scorched, broken human bones, hundreds, thousands of them. Vast pits had been dug into the floor, with a single path left between them that led to the other side. Asterius tried not to think about what the human sacrifices must have thought as they were dragged along that bridge, which was barely wide enough for the Grey Knights to walk across. The psychic echoes clinging to the human remains had hidden the monsters until they had reached the surface of the mass grave. But while their grim refuge had kept them from the night's psychic senses, the physical disturbances in the piles of bones had reached their ears. They had had only a few seconds to react, but it was enough. Asterius' sword severed the deformed head of the first monster to jump at them in a single, clean sweep. Its blood-red eyes opened wide in shock as it fell, and Asterius felt its last, silent screams before its brain realized it was dead. The Justica gave himself a single heartbeat to observe the creature he had just slain. Its bald head, which had rolled over the bridge and ended at Asterius' feet, seemed to have devolved from a human baseline. Its mouth was wide and contained only two singular canines, which were more akin to tusks than fangs due to their size. Its yellow eyes, split by vertical pupils, were wide open as if in shock, and a purple tongue spread from its mouth. Patterns of scales marked its pallid skin, forming shapes reminiscent of those displayed by scar tissue. The rest of its body was over 2 meters long. Thin membranes of scaled skin connected the upper limbs to the torso, which was still clad in the tattered remnants of rich finery. Each of the 4 limbs ended in an identical set of claws, some of which were covered in tiny engravings. Purple blood flowed from its severed neck, and the body was already starting to rot as the sorcerous energies that had animated it despite its violation of biology's most elemental principles faded away. This was no random mutation, as evidenced by the fact all of their attackers shared the same deviant traits. This was the creation of an infernal designer, pulled from mankind's antediluvian terrors and given flesh for the amusement of the ruinous powers. Asterius snarled in disgust and crushed the monster's skull under his boot. Spread across the bridge, the Grey Knight's mobility was much reduced. Each planted his feet, becoming a bastion of purity against which the mutants crashed uselessly. The hafts of Nemesis halberds were used as often as their blades, smashing into bodies mid-leap with sickening crunches. Asterius saw Japheth assailed by 3 of the creatures at once, their clawed hands imbued with pale red light. The Grey Knight cut one down and smashed in the skull of another, but the third slammed into his leg, breaking its fists against the blessed armor. Even as it plunged back into the sea of bones, screeching as its flesh burned from the holy touch of hallowed ceramite, Japheth lost his balance and began to fall. Asterius caught his brother's outstretched gauntlet and pulled him back to his feet, before ducking out of the way of Japheth's vengeful halberd as its blade caught another mutant in the torso. He rose back up and plunged his sword into the guts of another creature, while firing at yet another one. More and more of the mutants emerged from the bones. It was as if the slaughter of their kin was driving them into a frenzy, making them willing to throw their lives away in a futile attempt to take the Grey Knights down with them. Some of them were entirely wreathed in sorcerous energies, but even they were no match for the blessings and wards laid upon the Grey Knights' wargear. "Hold fast, brothers," Asterius called out. "We are the bulwark against corruption. We are the wall against evil. We shall never fall," came the reply. "We shall never break." And so they did. For nearly 10 minutes, the Grey Knights held their ground, cutting down all mutants who threw themselves against them. Until, at last, the piles of bones were still and unmoving once more. The Grey Knights did not know, as they resumed their advance deeper into the pyramid, that they had just brought the Ix, a mutated breed of half-demonic creatures which had ruled over an entire world for hundreds of years, to complete and utter extinction. But even if they had, they would have felt little emotion about that fact, other than, perhaps, the smallest tinge of satisfaction. Leaving the bone pits behind, the Grey Knights found themselves into a wide spiraling staircase. Every step was suffused with the pain of the captives who had been forced to hold themselves up on steps that had clearly been designed for space marines rather than humans. "We should already have reached the top of the pyramid," said Japheth after a while. "More signs of the Materium's distortion," came Manicius' reply. "Still, I think we are about to. Yes, here we are." The stairway ended before an archway leading into another room. Like the bone pits before, this room too had only two entrances, with the other being on the opposite side as the archway before the Grey Knights. Unlike the bone pits, though, the defenses of this room were plain to see. At the center of the empty room, held in place by silver chains that were linked to stakes embedded into the stone, was a tall, deformed beast of warped ceramite and twisted appendages. The creature had, at one point, been a space marine. Its space humanoid frame remained, but mutation after mutation had been heaped upon its once glorious form. Its skin was ivory white and bright pink, the two colors woven together in shapes that would have burned the eyes of an unaugmented human. Its left arm had become a nest of tentacles the color of rotting meat, each one ending with a glowing eye. Its legs bent backward and ended in paws covered in what looked like thin black fur, but Asterius could sense these were miniature tongues, not hair. Its head had no eyes, not even empty sockets where they must have been prior to the traitor's possession. A second mouth opened across the forehead instead, filled with jagged teeth and two black tongues that looked like two snakes coupling as they stirred in and out of the opening. The source of these mutations was obvious. It was the sword in its grip, its pristine aspect utterly at odds with its wielder's monstrous appearance. The weapon burned in Asterius' second sight with which light. Threads of this light were woven into the creature's entire body, and Asterius didn't doubt for an instant who was in control of this blasphemous union. The demon within the blade was of exceptional power, and if anything remained of the warrior who had foolishly sought its power beyond a hollowed, silently screaming shell, Asterius could not sense it. The possessed turned toward the Grey Knights, its flesh sizzling against its chains as it moved. It spoke, its voice like gravestones grinding together. "Welcome, little knights. Welcome to the Black Temple. I trust you have already tasted the hospitality of its master. Good. Then you know what to expect here." It lowered its head, as if trying to bow. "I am Uxnenuith, child of the Dark Prince. Once, I danced among the stolen stars of the Dari, and drank deep of the blood of the whore priestesses of Isha when they celebrated my master's birth. Will you tell me who you are, before we begin?" The name wasn't the demon's true name, of course. No creature of the warp was foolish enough to give such a weapon to an enemy, let alone one like the Grey Knights, who were covered in arcane protections, both obvious and hidden. But it was a name, and it contained within it some portion of the demon's identity. It was one of the weaknesses of the Neverborn. They could not simply use pseudonyms and false identities. As creatures of ideas and emotions, they were their names, and using one completely opposed to their true nature could very well rend them apart. The Grey Knights and the Inquisition had used this to identify the demonic patrons behind chaos cults throughout the Imperium many times before. No answer? How impolite. The servants of the Corpse Emperor used to be much more vocal when faced with one of my kind. Have you grown wiser? Or simply ruder? "You are not fit to hear our names, demon," said Asterius. "Know only that we are your death, and that of all your kind. We shall destroy this vessel you inhabit, and force you back into the pit from which you crawled." The unbound Lord too thought I could be forced out of this vessel. There was a sickening tone of pleasure in how the demon told the tale. He believed that his own master's witches could sever the bond between me and my dear, beloved Lucian. When he found out he was wrong, that he had denied his former superior the chance to rest in peace for a false hope. Oh, little knights. I wish I could tell you that his heart broke, but by that point, he didn't have much of it left already. I saw it happen, even from within my prison. Piece by piece of his soul, left burning in the flames of chaos as he walked further down the path to glory, always another step to take, always another deed to perform. And now, this. A brother, in spirit if not in blood, abandoned to the cruelty of the demon, to be used as a weapon against his enemies. He has changed, just as dear Lucian here has changed.
and he will change more, before the end.
Are you done, demon? Asked Asterius as the possessed fell silent.
Listening to the words of the Neverborn was never a good idea, but the Grey Knights needed more information about the enemy they would face in this campaign. Every sliver of information they gained from this operation, once properly analyzed and scoured for deceit, might be of vital importance later on.
Of course not.
We all know how this will end, but before we begin, there is one thing that tradition demands I do. You, little knight, are strong, stronger than poor Lucian ever was.
The creature's tone was filled with mocking respect.
Will you take me up, and wield my power in the name of your god? Will you bend the strength of the warp against itself?
Never.
The word was charged with all the revulsion and hatred Asterius felt.
Why not?
One of you wields one far more terrible than I already,
or has it not happened yet?
The possessed cocked its stolen head, seeming to ponder the possibility. Asterius didn't fall for the attempt at trickery, nor did his brothers. They knew that the demon was lying. The Hellspawns existed outside of linear time, and it was common for them to speak of events that had not yet happened when they were incarnated in the Materium. But the very idea of a Grey Knight ever wielding a demonic weapon was beyond ridiculous, it was obscene. The very thought of the possibility was heresy, and no champion of Titan would allow it to take root in his mind. Enough lies, spat the Justica.
We will destroy you,
abomination, and deal with your masters after.
We will not stop, not until all of your vile kind are purged from the stars.
The possessed chuckled, a wet and revolting sound.
You will try, and you will fail.
As one, the chains binding the creature snapped. This could not have been coincidence, something else was watching them, likely the same presence that had greeted the Grey Knights at the entrance of the pyramid, or, as the demon had called it, the Black Temple. Moving with inhuman swiftness, the possessed lunged at Asterius. Rather than the creature striking at him, it was as if the blade was moving on its own, dragging its wielder behind. Asterius barely managed to bring up his nemesis sword in time to block the first blow. Reality buckled as the blessed blade met the unholy weapon, and Asterius was forced to take a step back. The possessed warrior pressed its attack, striking with a speed and strength far beyond that of a normal Astartes, beyond even that of a Grey Knight. It took all of Asterius' own might, training and reflexes to parry or dodge every blow, and he dared not use his psychic abilities against such a foe. Since the Grey Knights had entered the Black Temple, they had avoided opening their minds. None of them were librarians, and they had been instructed to avoid taking such risks unless absolutely necessary. One-on-one, the issue of the duel was all but certain. All of the Emperor's gifts to Asterius could not match the unholy strength the dark gods had bestowed upon their pawn. All but one, that is. For while the possessed was alone, a feral beast kept in chains until let loose upon the foes of its masters, Asterius fought alongside his trusted brothers. The two of them had been fighting for less than 3 seconds when the first of them struck, having moved into position. The possessed weaved out of the way of the blow, moving with revolting, boneless grace. But in doing so, it put itself in the path of another strike. It dodged that one as well, but that was all. A blade cut deep into its flank, and a shell struck it in the shoulder. It stumbled, momentarily distracted, and Asterius seized his chance. His mind reached out to his brothers, and briefly, the 5 of them became one will, one mind, one blade. The nemesis power sword of the Justica moved with a speed and strength equal to that of the possessed, but driven by righteous fury instead of corrupt madness. It struck the demon sword point first, directly above the pommel. There was a flash of light as the energies surrounding the weapons fought, and the focused might of the Grey Knights prevailed over the ancient enchantments woven upon the tainted blade. The black metal twisted and cracked, before the blade that held the demon Uxnenueth broke into 1,000 pieces that burned holes into the stone floor. As the sword shattered, Asterius saw the demon's essence flee from its ruined vessel. It flowed through the connection between weapon and wielder, extinguishing the last spark of the host's soul utterly. The demon host, no longer a possessed, lunged at the Justica, its tentacles grasping for his head. He moved out of its reach and fired, blowing off the creature's knees. Another swipe of Percy's halberd severed the tentacles at the shoulder. The monstrous appendages fell to the ground with a wet sound, still twitching. The limbless, mutated torso fell down, unable to move. As one, the Grey Knights opened fire on their prone enemy, blasting it with holy shells until Asterius bade them to stop with a psychic command. They had inflicted enough damage upon the body, saturated the bloody remains with enough thrice-blessed ammo that the demon would not be able to use it as a gateway to fully manifest now that its bindings had been broken. With a bubbling sound, pieces of ceramite and flesh amidst the ruined remains melted, revealing a face that stared at the Grey Knights. This visage was human, a noble, patrician visage, which made its patchwork nature all the more revolting. It smiled mockingly at the warriors who towered above it as it spoke in the demon's voice. "Do you think this matter? Me, you, our masters, and our masters' masters. We all fight in the shadows of destiny, but nothing we do can ever alter what has been written by the powers beyond. You cannot change fate, little knight, and none of you will live to see the end of days, but I shall. Thank you for freeing me from this prison at last. I am in your debt, little knights." "Not so fast," growled Menicius. Before the demon's essence could fully dissipate, Asterius' brother was on its body. On his lips was the scourging litany, a holy incantation developed by the Supreme Grand Master himself and used for the first time during the secret wars of the Scouring. "You will pay for that, slave of the corpse god," howled Euxnenueth as the demon hammer smashed into its constructed face, and purifying psychic energy flowed through it as Menicius finished the litany, every word a blow as potent as the hammer's own. "I will hound your kind across the stars for all eternity. With a screech like rusted nails on chalkboard, the demon's burning pseudo-soul was banished, cast back into the warp with Menicius' brand upon it. No matter how high it may have claimed to sit in the infernal choirs, such a mark would not go unnoticed. The demon's torments were only beginning. Euxnenueth would return, one day. Not even all the lore of the Grey Knights could change that. The only known method of nullifying the threat of a single demon completely was to bind them within an impenetrable prison, and the mission's parameters didn't allow for that here. Perhaps it would be torn asunder by the claws of its kindred when it returned to them in shame, but somehow, Asterius doubted that. Truly powerful demons did not end so easily. But the Neverborn would remember the pain that Menicius had inflicted upon it here today. In fact, it would remember it forever. The heart of the Black Temple was a vast, circular room, with a domed ceiling supported by 10 pillars. Braziers lit the shadows with red, blue and green flames, yet Asterius' helmet display told him the temperature was barely above freezing. The sensation of disjointed reality which had been present since they had approached the pyramid was strongest here. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the exact dimensions of the room defied comprehension. Distances could only be measured as relative between two objects, and even then, there was no consistency. 2 of the braziers were less than a meter apart, yet one was less than 10 paces from where the Grey Knights had entered while the second was hundreds of meters distant. "We are running out of time," said Pallas as the Grey Knights passed through the archway. "Reality is coming apart. Whatever they are doing, we must stop it now." Each of the supporting pillars was wide as a dreadnought, covered in sculptures of demons and dark sigils. There were chains tightened around their top, and from where he stood Asterius could see that these served to hold captives bound, facing the inside of the circle formed by the pillars. The 10 men still bore the remnants of robes marked with the ecclesiarchy's emblem, but their foreheads had been branded with the 8-pointed star of chaos, and lines of eldritch scripture had been carved into their skin with great care. These marks covered every inch of skin Asterius could see, and they burned bright red in his helmet's infrared display, as did the eyes of these unfortunate servants of the Imperial Creed. In the end, their faith hadn't protected them from the depredations of the archenemy. He could sense the infernal essence dwelling within each of them. "Demon hosts," grunted Japheth. "Not possessed like the creature they had fought in the last chamber. These were corpses, their souls either mercifully lost before their bodies had been defiled, or long since devoured by the entities that now used their physical remains as vessels." The strike squad had experience fighting demon hosts, though the last ones they had battled had been far more amateurish, for lack of a better word, than these seemed to be. Cultists who had willingly offered themselves up to the monsters of the warp, believing that their sacrifice would result in some blessed afterlife instead of the horrible end their wretched souls had found instead. The demon hosts atop the pillars were different. For one thing, Asterius doubted the imperial priests had gone to their doom willingly. In a display of cruel irony that was typical of chaos, their defiance would only make them more appealing hosts for the demons that now wore their flesh. The demon hosts were far from being the only threat awaiting the Grey Knights. There were dozens of figures arrayed before them,
clad in tattered rags that did little to hide the mutations of their flesh. Feral psychers, their middling talents forced open by the power of chaos, at a terrible cost to their soul and sanity. In his second sight, Asterius could see the damage that had been inflicted upon their psyche. They were little more than animals now, driven by fear and hate. There were other figures scattered among this throng of the damned, tall, bulking abominations, with teeth and claws the size of sword. And there, too, were warriors clad in battle plate of black and gold, bearing the emblem of the chained demon head upon their shoulders. Forsaken Sons, the true power behind the Black Crusade which had swept over the Azeroth sector. And behind them, if behind meant anything in that broken space, was an altar, located atop a dais whose steps ran red with the blood covering them. Standing at the altar was a creature that blazed with power in the Grey Knight's second sight. Here, Asterius knew, was the master of the Black Temple, the one responsible for all the countless blasphemies that had occurred in it. It was tall, taller than the knights who had come to slay it. Its skin was stretched on its bones, to the point of breaking, and glowing veins could be seen coursing beneath it. A trio of curled black horns emerged from its forehead, casting shadow upon eyes that glowed golden. Its long, gangly arms were crossed across its chest, and its disturbingly normal feet hovered a few centimeters above the stone floor, which was charred black beneath the creature. Asterius had fought many demons in his years of service among the Grey Knights. He had faced the spawns of the ruinous powers in their many aspects, from the teeming, cackling masses of the Nurglings to the towering bloodthirster he and his brothers had battled on the plains of Merinos. Like all Grey Knights, he was learned in the various manifestations of the Neverborn, made to memorize lore of which the possession of a mere fraction would be grounds for immediate execution for any Imperial citizen. He had been made to know the demon, so that he may kill it. And this creature which stood at the head of this grotesque ceremony was no demon. Its appearance mimicked that of a demon host in the last stages of its flesh being overtaken by the corruption within. But the soul animating that warped body was not infernal in nature. It was like nothing Asterius had ever encountered, and it certainly wasn't a human soul, either. What had the Forsaken Sons wrought? Ah, our guests of honor have finally arrived. Welcome, noble lords, to the Black Temple. Welcome, Grey Knights. I am Jereb the Ascended, lord of this place. The voice of the creature was the same as the voice that they had heard at the entrance of the pyramid, before the statue's failed ambush. Despite all the damage that the Grey Knights had inflicted, all the enemies they had slain and the traps they had crushed, it was still just as full of arrogance as it had been then. But none of that mattered. This creature knew their chapter's name. How can this creature know about us? Hissed Perses over the Vox. Our chapter's secrecy has been kept for centuries, through the most ruthless methods at our disposal. Of course we know about you, mocked the abomination, as if it had been able to listen in on the warrior's encrypted Vox transmission. The Knights of Titan. Malcador's last blade, cast into the future even as the galaxy burned. Abaddon told my lord, and my lord told us. He didn't tell us how the despoiler came to such knowledge, but I like to think it was during the siege, by eating the brains of one of the Sigillite's leftover agents. It doesn't matter, Asterius sent to his brothers telepathically, not trusting to the Vox. Right now, our duty remains the same. The 5 Grey Knights charged toward the gathered cultists and Chaos Marines. Atop the dais, the creature spoke a word, and the chains that bound the 10 demon hosts to the pillars shattered. They flew through the air, leaving trails of fire behind them, laughing and screaming as they descended upon the Grey Knights. As one, the squad unleashed a volley of bolter rounds, but only a handful found their marks. The hit demon hosts didn't seem affected by the craters that opened in their chests, nor by the limbs that were blown off. Only one was destroyed, struck in the head by a precise shot from Percy's storm bolter. Its body ignited as it fell into the mass of cultists, who screamed as the warp flames caught on their twisted flesh and wretched souls. Then the remaining 9 were on them, striking with blazing claws, beams of which light, and words that tried to burrow into their minds. Unspoken, unknown, unseen, unheard. What is your name? The shadow burns, burns, burns in false fire. Hearken to the tolling of the bell. Mummy, there is a monster under the tower. Asterius managed to force the words out of his mind just in time to see a demon host on a collision course with him. He raised his sword arm, intent on cutting it in two before it could reach him, but the demon host suddenly accelerated and smashed into his hand with its left arm with such strength that the limb simply exploded at the impact,
but the strength of the blow had also been enough to make the Justicar relinquish his hold on the weapon, which fell to the ground. Before he could react, the demon host was on him, its remaining claw pawing at his armor, tearing purity seals and raking gashes in the blessed ceramite. Holy fury rose within him, and Asterius plunged both arms into the creature's skeletal chest, his gauntlets tearing through the rune-marked skin and burrowing into the tainted flesh beneath. You don't know what they took from you. He walks among the ashes of his dreams. What happened on Chthonia? You will not see it, or it will be too late for it to matter. As above so below. It is an older nightmare than they think. It must not wake, it must not. With a roar, Asterius pulled, and the demon host came apart in his hands, silencing its mad whispers. With a flicker of psychic energy, his sword leapt in his grip. Had any knot of the Grey Knights tried the same, the safeties of the blade would have obliterated their hands up to the elbow. Around him, the rest of his brothers were dispatching the last of the demon hosts, with Menetius smashing 3 of them apart in a single swing of his demon hammer. For the first time since entering the Black Temple, the warriors of Titan had not emerged from the short and brutal confrontation unscathed. Several of the Justicar's squad members were injured, their armor torn by the claws and sorcery of the demon hosts. But they were all still ready and able to fight. Before the Grey Knights, the horde of weirdlings and black-clad Chaos Marines stood still, save for those who had been set ablaze by the falling demon host. Their confidence had been shaken by the sight of the Emperor's servants defeating their master's pet abominations. Hesitation was spreading as the realization of their foe's true measure slowly sank into their minds. It was one thing to know that they had crossed all previous defenses, and another to see the might of the Grey Knights unleashed with their own eyes. But before they could break, Jerub spoke. Kill them all. They are the favored slaves of the corpse god. Eternal glory shall belong to those who slay them. The voice lashed at the souls of the heretics, and they sprung into action. The Chaos Marines opened fire first, bolt shells flying over the heads of the crowd. Their shots were wild and undisciplined, but the sheer volume of fire and lack of cover available to the Grey Knights made sure that plenty still hit, though none penetrated the Knights' blessed warplate. Caught in their master's frenzy, the cultists charged, screaming out their lungs, desperately trying to drown their own terror. The air around them rippled as their limited psychic powers bubbled out of their wretched souls, and things with no names and too many eyes peered from a realm that was getting entirely too close for Asterius' liking. For the Emperor! Shouted the Justicar, leading his brothers in a charge of their own. As they charged, the Grey Knights called upon their own psychic powers. Their armor and weapons glowed with protective auras, keeping the clumsy attempts at sorcery of the cultists from affecting them. When the spear formed by the strike squad met the crowd of warped mortals, the effect was like a chainsword meeting unprotected flesh. They tore through it without even slowing their advance, slaughtering the cultists and adding their blood to that of the countless thousands of sacrifices who had already perished in the room. It was only when they clashed with the Forsaken Sons amidst the horde that their charge slowed. The Forsaken Sons' origins were shrouded in mystery. They wore the colors of the infamous Black Legion, but not its emblem. Their flagship, the Hand of Ruin, which had been sighted at the Battle of Silberstadt, was recorded in Titan's archives as being a 16th Legion vessel, yet there were theories that the sorcerer who had slaughtered the Azeroth Conclave had belonged to the accursed bloodline of the Thousand Sons, though he had abandoned the Legion's heraldry. And the fragmented intel they had on events throughout the sector pointed to a coalition of various forces, using different approaches and tactics in the prosecution of the Black Crusade. Asterius had fought Chaos Marines before. Unlike some of the chapter's veterans, he had not lived through Abaddon's Black Crusade, let alone the Scouring or the heresy itself. Neither he nor any of the warriors under his command were that old. But they had encountered some of the arch-traitors' cohorts who had managed to escape their rightful imprisonment within the Eye of Terror. On a world whose name had been struck from all records, the strike squad had fought the Word-bearers, who had first broken their oaths of fealty to the Emperor and embraced the worship of the ruinous powers in ages past, and stopped their schemes from dragging an entire sector into damnation. That struggle had cost Asterius the lives of half his squad, as noble knights of Titan fought to prevent the Chaos Marines from summoning the demon prince who had arranged their passage out of the Eye of Terror into being. Despite these losses, when they had returned to Titan, it had been to be immediately sent back to join the Retribution fleet bound for Azeroth. Asterius remembered very well how the Chaos Marines had fought. Despite their degeneracy, the Sons of Lorga had fought well. They had been old warriors,
preserved from time by the foul powers of the warp, and they had combined ancient strategies with the unholy gifts of chaos. These Chaos Marines, however, were no veterans of the Horus heresy. They had the strength, speed and war gear of a space marine, but they lacked the discipline, the unity of true Astartes. They fought like they knew how to use the weapons they had been given, but not how to actually fight, at least, not against foes who were more than their match. They were raiders, not warriors. It was like facing psychopathic children given the power of demigods. They outnumbered the Grey Knights nearly 5-1, and yet the Sons of Titan were cutting them down almost as easily as they did their mortal slaves. Where had the Forsaken Sons found such troops? He moved to parry a blow from a chainsword, turning it aside before beheading the Chaos Marine who had struck it. The unexpected weakness of the foe was a boon that they could not afford to waste. The slaughter of the Chaos scum, as righteous as it may be, may actually be the foe's intent, with the blood and souls of the dead added to the ritual sacrifices. By that point, his subconscious had pieced together the broken geometries of this room, and he knew what he had to do. Purge them all, brothers, he pulsed to his squad. I will deal with the leader. Before any of them could object, he moved, stepping through the holes and stitches of space. His vision briefly turned dark, and he felt things slither on his skin despite his armor. Then he was back, standing atop the dais, less than 5 meters from the levitating Magister. The creature cocked its head as it looked at him, something like curiosity flickering in its soulless gaze. Impressive. You are adaptable as well as powerful. I am the Emperor's wrath, monster. No task is beyond me in his service. Its attention was focused on him. Good. He had to keep it that way. There was no telling how close the enemy's work was to completion, how easily it may be finished. The ether was thick with unfulfilled potential, taut with the threads of possibility that had been created through the sacrifice of countless thousands of innocent lives upon the altar. This close to the creature, he could feel the power radiating from it. It was mighty, of that there could be no question. But, you are no demon, he said, knowing he wasn't wrong, but unsure what the truth was. Is there any limit to the depths of blasphemy to which the Forsaken Sons will sink? It laughed. I am the future of mankind, puppet. All of humanity's pathetic weaknesses removed, replaced with divine strength. My creator went through 1,000 failures before he succeeded in creating me. Is this not the same thing which was done to you? It was Asteria's turn to laugh. Do you really think such pitiful insinuations are enough to make me doubt? We are nothing alike. Regardless of how you came to be, you are just another chaos-spawned abomination that I shall put down in the Emperor's name. Something that might have been a sneer flashed on Jerib's face, before vanishing just as quickly, replaced by the same arrogant smile it had worn before. Watch then, son of a dead god. Behold what I have wrought. Behold the true power of chaos. Crimson smoke suddenly filled the air as the blood that had covered the altar suddenly evaporated, revealing the object beneath. The altar had been crafted out of the same black stone as the rest of the pyramid, and was engraved with unholy runes that glowed with baleful energy similar to those the Grey Knights had seen on their approach of the Black Temple. This close, however, Asterius could actually recognize the runes. He had seen their kind before, not so long ago, during that grim campaign that had cost the lives of 5 of his brothers. These were Colchizian runes, the infernal language of Lorga's warrior priests. Once, Colchizian had been but one of humanity's countless languages, pieced together from scraps after the coming of the Old Night and the sudden collapse of humanity's first interstellar empire. But as the influence of the ruinous powers subtly crept into the priesthood of Colchis, the very language had become a vector for their corruption. Many of the Ordo Malleus believed that this had played a part in the ultimate corruption of the Primarch Lorga, who had been cast down on Colchis after being stolen from the Emperor by the ruinous powers. The cuneiform language had become a carrier of nightmares and madness, used to inscribe the bastardized representations of chaos unwords upon the materium. There were still a handful of ancient Colchizian texts left in the galaxy that used a version of the language predating its corruption, several of which were safely stored in Titan's most secured archives, and the word-bearers sought their destruction with typical single-mindedness. Asterius had learned all of this during his initiation, where portions of the chapter's accumulated lore had been distilled into his mind through hypno-training. Since then, he had compounded that knowledge with more hands-on experience. He could not read Colchizian, but he could recognize some of the symbols covering the altar,
and piece together an interpretation of their meaning.
He had been wrong. They had all been wrong, ever since they had seen the trails in the desert.
The Black Temple did not store the psychic energy generated by the deaths of the human sacrifices.
It was much, much worse than that. It stored their souls. Now that the blood,
and the final impressions of terror and pain that it held,
was gone, the Justica could see the souls of the dead trapped within the altar upon which they had died. The altar that stood atop the dais was only the tip of a massive structure, carved out of a single block of stone, that plunged into the depths of the Black Temple like the roots of some eldritch tree. The spirits of the Emperor's subjects who had been brought here and butchered were trapped in that stone, held between death and their ultimate destination. Not even the Grey Knights knew for certain what that may be, only the damnation of the heretics was sure. But whatever awaited mortal souls in the beyond, it couldn't be worse than this blasphemy. Ah, you have finally realized, haven't you? The true nature of this great work of mine.
Illumination comes to all sooner or later,
whether in this life or in the next.
You don't just intend to cause a warp breach, said Asterius out loud, speaking to himself rather than the creature, too horrified to react to its taunts.
If you did, all you would need would be their pain and death.
To keep their spirits trapped like this,
a power source? You are clever.
Marvelous,
isn't it?
In life, these wretches served no purpose, but in death, their weak, blind souls will fuel my great work. They will lit a great pyre that will consume the boundary between this bleak reality and the realms of the gods, not just here on this world, but across the entire system. The void itself will be torn asunder, and all shall be brought under the aegis of chaos. Images of what would happen flickered in Asterius' mind as he imagined the consequences. If the Beranos system was plunged into a localized warp storm, all routes leading to and from it would be blocked, navigable only by ships crewed by the most expert of navigators, or those, like the Forsaken Sons, who had access to heretical methods of sailing the Empyrean. The Imperial Retribution fleet would be stranded at Beranos, and the Azeroth sector would be cut off from the reinforcements it desperately needed. The Grey Knights would be unable to deal with the threats rising within that region. It was unacceptable.
You will be the first to die, continued to taunt Jereb.
You will fight,
no doubt,
but not even warriors such as you can withstand the infinite hordes of chaos for long. You will die,
and then it will be the turn of your little fleet.
The children of the gods will rend you apart, and build a kingdom upon the ashes of this system.
It will be
magnificent.
And Beranos will only be the start.
We will drown the entire Imperium in a tide of chaos, born of the burning souls of the corpse god's own subjects. For the first time, the creature moved its arms, weaving an arcane pattern in the air with its clawed fingers. The air shimmered between it and Asterius as light from a distant location passed through, a war portal, open to another location on the planet. He caught a glimpse of a darkened room, and figures clad in black armor.
You are strong, but you are
alone.
How many more unbound can you kill?
Its smile widened, and its voice deepened and echoed all around them.
Malone.
This one stands alone. Send the others, and we can take him. Perhaps even alive. How glorious would that be? Asterius tensed, prepared to face whatever fresh horror emerged from the shimmering portal, but nothing came. The light emanating from it flickered and vanished as it shut down, and Jereb recoiled, eyes wide and black smoke rising from its burnt fingers. Whatever had just happened, it had taken the abomination by surprise. Treachery within the enemy ranks, perhaps? Hatred distorted the creature's features even further. No matter. I shall deal with you myself, and complete the work before your brothers can intervene. The glory of fulfilling Ilia's legacy shall be mine. A flash of recognition passed through Asterius' mind. Ilia's. He knew that name from the briefings that had occupied much of the Grey Knight's time during the journey to Beranos. In its folly, the abomination had revealed what might be a vital clue. This would be a matter for later consideration, however. Right now, he had a mission to accomplish, lest this grotesque endeavor succeed. Jereb was rising before him, drawing power in preparation for an attack. Time seemed to slow as the Justica considered his options. He did not doubt that he could defeat Jereb if the two of them came to blows. But the energies unleashed by their confrontation may trigger the final step of the ritual and make all of the Grey Knight's efforts for naught. Fulfilling the objective was more important than defeating Jereb. In fact, considering what the chapter suspected was happening in Azeroth, it was more important than the lives of his entire squad. Brace yourselves, brothers, he sent to his squad. "This is going to hurt." The reply from Manetius was nearly panicked. "Brother Justica, what are you doing?" In a single burst of telepathic communication, Asterius sent all that he had learned of the Black Temple's purpose and construction, along with every word Jereb had spoken, into the minds of his brothers. Even if he did not survive what he was about to do, the chapter had to be informed of what he had learned. "The souls of the dead are the power source of this abomination. They are the key," he explained. A pulse of understanding came back through the connection, and he felt his brothers raise up their mental defenses. The entire exchange had lasted less than a single heartbeat, and now it was time for Asterius to do what he must, as hundreds of Grey Knights had done before him. Rising his nemesis sword in both hands, Asterius turned his back on the ascending Hellspawn, and plunged his weapon into the ritual altar. The power field surrounding the blade cut through the black stone with ease, and through the sword, the Justica made contact with what was trapped within. The entire chamber shook, throwing cultists to the ground. Jereb roared in fury and reached for Asterius, aiming to throw him away before he could undo the creature's gruesome work. But it would be too late. The world of flesh moved far too slowly compared to the realm of the mind, which was where Asterius' battle was now being waged. He could feel them all. Thousands upon thousands of them, screaming in pain, horror and madness. Despite the terror, there were a few voices who were praying, reciting hymns of devotion to the Emperor, clinging to their faith even in this purgatory. But these sparks of sanity were but a drop in an ocean of torment and confusion. He caught flickers of burning memories, his hands moving on an assembly line, the sound of acidic rain falling on his harp cell, a lover's kiss exchanged on his life's happiest day. They were dead, all of them, men and women alike, and if there were no children, it was only because none of them had survived the grueling journey to the Black Temple. He felt his own identity begin to slip from his grasp, and tightened his hold on his own thoughts. He was Asterius of the Grey Knights, a warrior of the immortal god Emperor. He was a son of Titan. Turning his focus inward, he sharpened his will, forging his own awareness into a spear of etheric energy. The howling of the spirits redoubled, yet Asterius noticed he was untroubled by it. Beyond the reach of this prison, he could feel a presence looming, potent and sharp. He recognized it as Jereb, who was trying to finish the ritual by brute force before Asterius could bring it all down. But Asterius could also sense that the howling of the spirits was acting as a barrier, keeping the abomination's will at bay. Had the dead servants of the Emperor somehow understood what he was attempting, and were now helping him as one final act of defiance against their killers? Perhaps. He threw the spear, aiming it straight at the containment wards. There was an explosion of psychic fire, which spread along the very channels which had been made to direct the ritual's power. In a raging inferno, the souls trapped alongside Asterius were ignited, released at last from their torment. The seraphic power, born from the spark of the Emperor's own divine might that dwelled within the soul of every Grey Knight, roared as it obliterated the sorcery of the Forsaken Sons. Close to Asterius and yet impossibly far, Jereb screamed in rage and denial as it, too, was annihilated by the blast. The Black Temple shook and began to collapse, as the vile sorceries that enforced its impossible geometries were undone. Despite everything, the Justica could not help feeling a touch of horror at what he had done. The Grey Knight was no stranger to killing Imperial citizens. The necessities of the war against chaos could not be avoided, lest all they fought for was brought to ruin. But to destroy the very souls of the innocent dead, whose only sin had been to be taken alive by the cultists and brought here. Yet oblivion at the hands of a Grey Knight was better than being used as fuel for chaos ends. He could take comfort in that truth, cold as it was. Then he felt nothing more, as blackness took him. Halfway across the planet from the Black Temple, Malone, Lord of the Unbound, let out a breath, and lowered his pistol. Before him, the wretched thing that had once been a standard Imperial communication servitor twitched and fell, a massive hole in its chest, its unholy screaming finally silenced. "So, we are done with Jereb, then?" Igdal called out from behind his brother. Malone nodded. "I cannot say I will miss that foul creature, yet this is still cause for concern." The two Unbound stood within a chamber deep inside their mountain stronghold. Iams was also present, and the only other soul left in the room. The sorcerer knelt at the center of a complex ritual circle that occupied most of the open floor, blood dripping from his nose, ears and eyes. A patch of scorched stone stood before him, where had stood the portal through which the warriors that had fought in the Black Temple had passed moments ago.
It was gone now, and the scar in reality it had left had been cauterized close by the psychic inferno unleashed by whatever it was that had happened at the Black Temple. 24 Unbound, noted Igdal, supported by Jerub's pet monsters, after they had already faced all the horrors of the temple's gauntlet, including poor Lucian. And not only did the enemy kill them, judging by the fact that the skies haven't started bleeding, they also stopped Jerub's plan. I don't know about you, brother, but I don't like these results at all. Just who are these warriors? Malone shook his head, hiding his own surprise at how total the defeat of the Black Temple's defenders had been. From the moment the attack had begun, they had received reports on the situation from Jerub, the false demon's words spoken by the now destroyed servitor. When the attackers had reached Lucian, Jerub had torn open a portal with Iam's help, through which they had sent 2 full packs of Unbound to support the false demon's last stand. And in the end, it had all been for nothing. Jerub had called for more reinforcements, but Malone had had neither the time to bring more warriors into the chamber, nor the will to send more Unbound to their deaths. He had ordered Iams to close the connection, and moments later, the communication servitor had started to scream and melt, until he had put it out of its misery. "This is not for you to know," he finally replied. "I am already stretching the boundaries of Lord Arkan's commands simply by involving you in this matter." "Then why do so at all then? Why take me from my other duties and drag me here?" "Because," said Iams suddenly, his eyes snapping open, "our leader didn't trust Jerub not to try something. Just as we sent our brothers to their doom, so too could it have sent something back if it had tried. He wanted you here so that you could watch his back if it happened." "I thought I forbade you from peering into my mind, Iams," growled Malone. "So you did, and so I have done. It doesn't take a genius to see your reasoning, my lord." The Lord of the Unbound glared at the sorcerer, unsure whether or not he was speaking the truth. In the end, knowing that he had no way to know for sure, he let it go. In all the time they had fought alongside one another, Iams had never given Malone cause to doubt his loyalty. "Are you confident the way is sealed?" he asked. "No one will be able to use it to get in?" Iams laughed weakly. "There is no way left, brother. Whatever our enemies did at the Black Temple, any trace of the portal was completely burned away. I felt the psychic shockwave all the way here, and I think even our fleet will notice it soon. For all our sakes, I hope that this particular foe will not take part in the war for Beranos, or we might as well fall on our blades and get it over with quickly. I doubt this. Psychic detonation is something they can do on command. No, this feels like Jerub's ritual went awry. And we need not worry about them participating in the rest of the battle. They came to deal with Jerub's ritual. The rest of this war will be fought by more conventional troops. The Black Temple was their only target in this system. They will want to save their strength for later. Even so, this will not be an easy battle, said Igdal. I have seen the preliminary estimations of the enemy's strength in the system. The enemy troops match ours in raw numbers, and I have little doubt theirs are more disciplined. Marcus was still trying to get the Knights of Beribbon and the Cerulean companies back in line when we left the command center and came down here. We have this fortress and those around it, said Malone. The craft of our Mechanicum allies and the sons of Perturabo among us will compensate for the enemy's superior leadership. All that the armies under our command need to do is die fighting, and that is something even the least of the wretches we culled from the Wailing Storm can do. You have grown cold, Malone. There was no accusation in Igdal's words, no condemnation. It was simply a statement of fact, and any emotion the Unbound felt at the observation was carefully concealed. Less so than our master. Or do you believe that Lord Arkan truly regards us as brothers? We are weapons to him, and have been since we were taken from the dark and remade by Jacaerus craft. And these warriors were to us as we are to him. Some are more useful than others, but they are all tools to our ends, just as we are tools to Arkan's own. The Unbound they had sent across to die in the Black Temple had been of the latest generation, raised from the children of slaves taken by the Forsaken Sons during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. Unlike when Malone and Igdal had been created, the Fleshmasters had aimed for quantity over quality when they had inducted them into the ranks of the Astartes. Arkan had demanded that the Fleshmasters make an army of these harvested children, and the Fleshmasters had delivered. Some of them had resented the order, seeing it as a waste of their talents, while others had relished the fresh challenge it presented. In the end, however, they had all done as the Awakened One asked.
The data they had collected by observing the first generation of Unbound fighting across the Wailing Storm had been put to good use. Instead of the customized designs used for the first generation, each aimed at producing a warrior who excelled at a particular aspect of warfare, the second generation had been conceived with numbers and adaptability in mind. The gene seed harvested from fallen Forsaken Sons and Sons of Calthalike had been cultivated in vats, allowing the Warband to stretch its limited supply of the priceless genetic material. Techniques first designed during the heresy by apothecaries desperate to replenish the ranks of legions bled by the Warmaster's War had been put to use, breaking a number of oaths the Fleshmasters had once made, back before they had broken their most important vow of all. Yet more desecration had taken place in order for the recruits to be ready in time for the Black Crusade. The bodies of dead Forsaken Sons, already stripped of gene seed, were used as raw material by dark mechanicum machines. These dark tech constructs had transformed the remains of the dead into a biological liquid that, when intravenously fed into the future Unbound, combined with their omophagia implant, enabled them to absorb some of the experience of the fallen warriors. There had been some backlash from elements within the Forsaken Sons at this, but the reasoning of Archon, that this enabled the fallen to strike at the Imperium beyond death, had been enough to calm them down. Many of the aspirants who had survived the gene seed implantation had been driven mad by this training process, their minds consumed by the endless scenes of violence and death. But Archon did not waste any resources, and these unfortunate souls had been sent to other commanders, who cared even less for their lives than Malone did. Some had even been given to the Blood Champion, cast into the warp alongside him to fight in the jungles of Andros Rest. The madness that followed the second-born chosen would make even the dregs of the Fleshmasters' vats into useful fighters. The Unbound host had received the greater part of these warriors before the beginning of the Black Crusade. Their first engagement had been at Silberstart, and they had proven that they could fight, at least. Most were aboard the fleet, ready to take part in the space battle that would begin as soon as Morkoth reached the Imperial Armada. But Malone had kept a handful of Pax planetside. A leader never knew when he would need some expendable shock troops to throw at a problem. Malone wondered, briefly, if this was how Archon had felt when he had cast the first Unbound at the walls of High Vanister, on the planet Paraxis Sulfur. Back then, the Fleshmasters' creations had yet had to prove their worth, and the Awakened One hadn't hesitated in using them in that assault's most dangerous part, even going as far as to deploy them alongside the Blood Champion, who wasn't known for his restraint and ability to distinguish between friend and foe. Since then, Malone had risen to become a lord of his own, and the lives of those he called brothers were now his to spend. When Jerub had opened the portal, he had known that he was very likely sending these Unbound to their deaths, but had found that he hardly cared. With so many forces under his command, it was difficult to see any individual as anything else than a resource to be used. Perhaps more elite forces would have been able to defeat the silver-armored intruders, and save Jerub and its plans. Malone doubted it, however, and it wasn't his part in Archon's grand design to kill them anyway. Jerub's demise and the loss of the Black Temple had served its purpose. It had confirmed that the so-called Grey Knights were indeed present among the Imperial Retribution fleet. Igdal frowned, and Malone realized that he had been lost in thought for nearly a full minute. "And you are fine with that? I have seen the tactical projections. With luck and cunning, we might be able to defeat the Imperial forces currently in the system, but they are only the first wave. Without Jerub's ritual to summon the warp tides and cut off any reinforcements, our prospects of survival, let alone victory, dwindle to nothing in the long term. Are you satisfied with us being nothing more than sacrificial pawns hurled before the Imperial tide to gauge its strength?" Iams chuckled. The aura of power that surrounded him flickered with cold amusement. "Our commander doesn't intend for us to be sacrificed, Igdal. He has a plan. Don't you, brother?" "Indeed. Remember that I am the one here who was entrusted with Archon's designs." He regarded the two Unbound, one his old friend, a brother in all but birth, the other a comrade in arms whose bond they had forged in fire. "And while the Awakened One may consider us all expendable, I do not intend to die fruitlessly, and the two of you, at least, are not expendable to me." Igdal remained silent for several seconds before nodding. "I trust you, Malone. Just, be careful. Somehow, I doubt Archon told you everything he has planned. Even those of us who aren't chosen know that the Awakened One's ambitions reach further than simply laying waste to the Azarok sector. At least none of the Ix remain, noted Iams, his face briefly contorting into a grimace of disgust. Hateful creatures. You should have killed them all after we learned what the pit, and they, really were, Malone. It's not like they were of any use in the Black Temple. Arsam told us we still had a few centuries before even their eldest reached maturity, said Malone, repeating the same argument that he had made a dozen times since the muster of the Black Crusade. It would have been a waste, both of them and of the resources it would have taken to make sure they were all dead. Besides, it might have made Jereb suspicious. Are we sure all of them are dead? Asked Tigdal. Iams is right, their destruction is one of the few silver linings to this debacle I can think of, but if there are any left, the Unbound Host, and the Forsaken Sons in general, were willing to use many horrific weapons, and had committed truly atrocious deeds without batting an eyelid. But even Malone could admit that what Arsam's divinations had revealed about the X's true nature and potential final forms appalled him. Perhaps if there had been a way for the mutants to reach, that in time for the Black Crusade, Archon would have ordered it, one more catastrophe unleashed to serve the Awakened One's goals. But there hadn't been, and so the pit's best use had remained using it to kill a son. No, said Iams. They were all at the Black Temple, I made sure of it. And there is no way any of them survived the destruction unleashed there. And even if they did, without the pit, they would wither away, all right. In any case, now that the Black Temple is gone, Morkoth should reach the Imperial fleet soon, Igdal sighed. I must return to the command center and make sure everything is ready if, when they make it through. The failure of the false demon meant that they could no longer hope to draw the entire Baronos system into the warp, where the Unbound Host's experience at fighting within hostile empiric conditions would have given them the advantage. But that didn't mean they had lost. The Imperial fleet was still reeling from the destruction of the system's outermost world, and the true war hadn't even yet begun. But Igdal was right, though Malone felt obligated to defend their brother. Morkoth is a capable fleet master. You saw that in the Wailing Storm, and at Silberstadt. He is, but somehow I doubt our luck is that good that he will triumph over them and we won't need to fire a single shot. This is our first true void battle in real space since Silberstadt, and the odds aren't nearly as skewed in our favor now as they were then. Are you coming? Not yet. Get back to the command center, Malone gestured to Igdal and Iams. I have one last thing to take care of. The thing that stirred before Malone was called a Metatron. It had once been an astropath, captured during the Battle of Silberstadt and remade by the Coven into a limbless, mewling creature trapped in a cybernetic chair that was at once its life support unit and its containment prison. It had been brought here, in Malone's personal quarters, by servitors which had then been reassigned to the training cages of the Blade of Terror, where their lifespan was measured in days. No one but Malone knew it was there, indeed, no one in this system but him knew it even existed. According to Arsam's lecture, when the Sorcerer of Blood had handed this one over to Malone, the Metatrons had first been created during the Heresy. When the Dark Gods had filled the galaxy with warp storms, isolating the pockets of Imperial resistance and making communication all but impossible, Horus allies had used the Metatrons to remain in contact with one another as they prosecuted the war. The Sorcerer Lord hadn't gone into the details of their creation, but he had explained that, because of what they had gone through, the Metatrons could only speak with one another. Normal astropaths couldn't hope to understand the words they projected across the stars, and this was for this reason that Lord Archon had commanded the Coven to create enough of the wretched things for all of his Black Crusade's separate forces to use. Most communication was still taking place over astropathic channels which could be monitored by the Imperium, though the encryption ciphers designed by the Coven were as vicious as they were complex. Use of the Metatrons was restricted to these transmissions which couldn't be entrusted to more mundane star speakers, and couldn't be risked being overheard by the enemy. The message Malone had to send today certainly qualified. Malone pressed a handful of runes on the Metatron's control panel, and spoke his authorization codes into its audio receptors, carefully enunciating each of the 100 letters password syllables. Any mistake, Arsam had warned, and the Metatron would be compelled by its machine prison into unleashing its full psychic potential all at once, something a non-psyker like Malone had no hope of surviving. But, like all Astartes, Malone had an eidetic memory, and he made no mistake. The Metatron twitched and moaned, and the air in the chamber grew cold, while the light dimmed and the shadows seemed to lengthen. Across the tides of the Empyrean, what remained of the Metatron's soul was stretching out, reaching toward another of its kind. Somewhere in the Azeroth sector, Malone only suspected where exactly. Another Metatron started to cry out, drawing its master's attention. Malone waited for half an hour. Then, finally, the Metatron spoke. Malone. The voice of the Metatron was barely recognizable as a voice. While the words were understandable, they were laced with the echoes of distant screams that were the Empyrean's equivalent of static. Yet still, Malone recognized the voice. It was that of his master, Archon the Awakened One, Lord of the Forsaken Sons and Supreme Commander of the Black Crusade.
Yes, my lord.
It is I. I have news. How goes the war? The Imperials have arrived, and the first blows have been struck from both sides. They have yet to make planetfall, but I believe our forces are evenly matched. We will be able to hold for some time. Very well. But you would not have contacted me like this if this were all you had to report. There was no implied threat in the Awakened One's words, he was simply stating a truth both of them knew. No, my lord. I have called to inform you that they are here. Cherub's schemes drew them out. As you predicted, the Grey Knights have come to Azeroth. The Metatron made it difficult to gauge Archon's emotional response, and the Awakened One wasn't the most open of souls even in person. Even so, Malone could hear something in his master's voice, though whether that was satisfaction, eagerness or cold fury, he wasn't sure. How many? Only a handful were deployed, but there might be more, and even those few were enough to tear through Cherub's defenses like paper. Their ships are hidden from our auspexes, even with the Dark Mechanicum's upgrades. I apologize that I do not have more information. No need, Malone. You have done well. Focus on holding Beranos for as long as possible. Buy time for our other plans to progress. Then, you know what to do. Yes, answered the Lord of the Unbound, bowing his head despite the fact Archon couldn't see him. We shall meet again in person before this crusade ends, concluded the Awakened One. The Metatron went silent. Malone waited several minutes to make sure that the conversation was over, then pressed the runes that would return the wretched creature to its slumber. Then, he departed his quarters. There was much yet to be done. Perseus walked through the corridors of the promised deliverance. The transmitter was a relic from pre-imperial times, and had belonged to the chapter since its foundation. It was part of a network of several such devices, which, through the arcane secrets of the Dark Age of technology, could communicate with one another regardless of the distance separating them, but only as long as they were in the same star system. Transition through the warp jumbled their configuration, and they needed to be put together and resynchronized after every warp jump. Even with that limitation, the Adeptus Mechanicus would have paid a Forge World's ransom for the artifacts, even gone to war to recover them, had they been in the hands of anyone else. But the Grey Knights' leadership rightfully believed that such faster-than-light communication methods was too valuable an asset to the chapter to trade for mere political gain. It was rare for the devices, called Ansibles by the chapter's tech marines, to be used. The Grey Knights rarely deployed in numbers justifying the use of several starships. But this was an unusual campaign. When the Grey Knights had deployed to join the Retribution Crusade, the vaults of the chapter had been opened by the tech marines, and the Ansibles deployed across the fleet. The one before Perseus had been transferred to the promised deliverance just before the ship had separated from the rest of the Imperial fleet, and now, as Perseus pressed the activation runes in the correct sequence, it would establish contact with another located aboard the battle barge Fire of Dawn. The hololithic projector that had been added to the Ansible flickered to life, projecting the image of a proud and regal face that looked upon Perseus with an inscrutable gaze. Grandmaster Koios saluted Perseus, bowing his head to his superior, the commander of the Second Brotherhood of the chapter. Even as an hololithic projection, to be in the presence of one of the eight, the founders of the Grey Knights, chosen by Malkador the Sigillite himself and blessed by the Emperor during the darkest days of the heresy, was an honor beyond measure. Brother Perseus. Where is Justica Asterius? He is recovering. The damage he sustained was severe. Even if we were able to teleport back before the physical consequences of our victory caught up with us, I am here to report in his stead. Our mission on Beranos was successful, the schemes of our foes there were stymied. Very well. Proceed, brother. For the next few minutes, Perseus described what had transpired on the surface of Beranos.
He spoke of the Black Temple, of the defenses the strike squad had encountered, of all that they had observed and of Asteria's own discoveries, transmitted telepathically before his desperate strike to prevent catastrophe. "You and your brothers have performed well," said Koios when he was finished. "Just take Asterius especially. Make your way back to the fleet, but be cautious. The enemy knows you are here now, even if they haven't detected the promised deliverance. I will transmit your report to Supreme Grandmaster Janus. Azarok Sector, Beranos System. 744.M32. In the dim light of the demon ship Blade of Terror's bridge, the obsidian teeth of Morkoth gleamed as the fleet master of the unbound host smiled. He had not stopped smiling since the Shiva's wrath had fired, destroying the outermost planet of the system and throwing the carefully ordered formation of the Imperial fleet into disarray. That smile was making the bridge officers who had not already been absorbed into the Blade of Terror very nervous. Life aboard the demon ship was hard and often short, especially for mortals. There were things roaming the lower decks born of the infernal presence that infested every piece of the ship that had once been called the Blade of Terror. The slaves who packed the vessel were as much crew as they were food for the demon ship, with only those who proved of use allowed a degree of protection. The bridge officers were among those worthy few, but even they knew that the blade could turn on them and devour them at any moment should Morkoth withdraw his protection. Morkoth had been the first to actually tame the demon ship since it had been transformed into its current form, at the dawn of the conquest of the Wailing Storm. Members of the crew who had his favor were more or less safe from the ship's hunger, but the unbound fleet master was fond of removing that favor as a way of punishing those who failed him or didn't show him the proper respect, or, sometimes, just because it amused him. Typically, such rebukes only lasted for a single standard day. If the crew member managed to survive that long, then he or she had clearly proven that they could still be of use. It was rare, but it had happened before, and except for one unfortunate case all of these still worked on the bridge to this day. Since assuming command of the Blade of Terror, Morkoth had rarely smiled, and his smile had always meant someone else either was suffering, or was about to. Most of the time, it had been the enemies of the Warband that had suffered, but the crew had still learned to dread the sight. So long as they did not let their fear affect their performance, neither Morkoth nor the Blade cared. In fact, the demon ship seemed to relish the fear of the crew, savoring it like a mortal man might an appetizer, something to whet his appetite before the true meal began. Something which had once been an hololithic projector, but was now a giant, translucent orb filled with something the heretics refused to name displayed the situation in the Beranos system. Sparks of light, blue for the enemy, red for Morkoth's forces, marked the position of the ships of the two fleets. Around Morkoth's command throne, screens showed more detailed information about the enemy fleet, gleaned from the auspexes of the Blade of Terror that were linked to the handful of auspex officers who had been sacrificed to their posts, forever merged to their stations. Morkoth absorbed the flow of strategic data with a practiced eye. After several hours of confusion and desperate maneuvers, the Imperial fleet was pulling itself free of the asteroid field created by the destruction of Beranos V. The last stragglers of the unkindness were abandoning pursuit and retreating to the ruins of the frozen world, digging into the larger chunks of the world to lay to rest, their bloodlust sated for now. Between the unkindness's assault and the asteroids, the auspexes had registered 9 enemy ships destroyed in the ambush, with many more suffering various degrees of damage. Only the lesser crafts had been destroyed, escort ships and troop carriers. But the ambush had still fulfilled its purpose. The Imperial fighter wings had been crippled, and the Imperial fleet would face Morkoth's armada with its formation disturbed and its void shields already strained by the asteroid field. And there was more to it than that. The loss of a few lesser ships, the culling of their fighter wings, the damage to shields and hulls, those were important, but were not enough on their own for the importance Morkoth had placed upon the Shiva's wrath succeeding in its mission. Morkoth could sense it, piece it together from 100 scattered bits of information. He could hear it in snippets of Vox transmission that were now reaching the armada and decrypted by the Blade's demon-touched cogitators, in the way the enemy ships moved. The Imperials were rattled, their confidence shaken by the awesome might their foe had displayed. They had come to make war upon those with the power to destroy worlds. The crew of these ships, who had been trained to fight in battles of cold calculation where every decision stretched across minutes or even hours, where every attack could be seen coming, had been struck by surprise and overwhelming force. The Unbound could almost taste their fear. It was his heritage, he supposed. While many Unbound neither knew nor cared from where the gene seed that had transformed them had come, Morkoth had never needed to wonder. From the color of his eyes to the memories running through his blood and his own temper, all had always pointed to him belonging to the gene line of the 8th Legion. Such things hardly mattered among the Forsaken Sons, and even less so among the Unbound, whose connection to the old legions was even more tenuous than those of their legionary brethren. But it still affected them. Not all aboard the enemy ships would be afraid, of course. Morkoth could see the outlines of Space Marine vessels, bearing the markings of chapters he did not recognize from his implanted memories. The Astartes aboard would not be rattled by the destruction of Beranos v their mortal crew, though? That was another matter entirely. What news from Julius? Morkoth asked. The Shiva's wrath had been silent since firing. Lord Julius reports that the damage to the Shiva's wrath falls within the expected limits, sir, answered the same Vox officer who had given the wrath its order to fire. It won't be able to fight anytime soon, months of repair, according to Lord Julius. Morkoth nodded. That was what they had expected. Very well. Tell Julius to try to make it look like the Shiva's wrath is still able to fire if he can. The mere threat of another shot could serve us well. Yes, Lord. It was doubtful Julius would be able to do what Morkoth asked of him, but you never knew. Perhaps Julius would surprise him. In truth, he had taken the Shiva's wrath out of his plans the moment it had successfully fired. Even that much had been a gamble. Morkoth had seen the schematics of the wrath that the heretics had managed to sketch, and though he was not particularly versed in the Mechanicum's arts, even he had recognized how unstable the entire thing was. But it had worked, and given them the first blood in the coming Void battle. It was one advantage, and they would need it. They had been contacted by the forces on the surface moments ago. Apparently, Cherub's gambit to drown the entire system into a warp storm had failed, the false demon slain by agents of the Imperium that had made it past the Black Temple's defenses. While Morkoth didn't mourn the creature's destruction, the notion that the Imperials had somehow managed to slip by his fleet without him noticing was unsettling. Estimated time until we reach weapon range? He asked another menial. He already knew the answer, of course, but it couldn't hurt to double-check his own calculations. 17 minutes and 54 seconds, replied the man immediately. Off by 3 seconds. Not too bad, he thought. We will see who was right soon enough. The fleet master of the Unbound settled back into his command throne, watching as the time of carnage drew closer. His smile grew a little wider. Let the game begin, he whispered. The names of lost ships passed before the eyes of Lady Admiral Rebecca Delbaranthia, each accompanied by the estimated numbers of crew and passengers that hadn't been rescued from the wrecks. 9 ships in total. Tens of thousands of crew lost, with only a fraction saved from the void. There may be more, hanging in escape pods and crippled gunships, but Rebecca couldn't let any ship hang back in the asteroid field to recover them, not when the surviving monsters could return. This wasn't a crippling blow, not for a fleet of that size, but still one that had been dealt without them being able to inflict any damage in exchange, except for the cybernetic abominations the fighter wings had managed to destroy, and that was not an acceptable trade. Since arriving in the system, they had been dancing on the heretics' tune, playing directly into their hands. They will pay for this, she vowed silently to herself, echoing the oaths that had already been sworn over the Vox. By the Emperor, they will pay. The Perseus's shields and guns had protected her from the asteroids, but her fighter wings had been decimated by the cybernetic abominations. Only a scant few interceptors had made it back to the hangar bays, not nearly enough to be deployed again in this conflict. Auspexes, she called out, what's the status on that super weapon? The power levels are fluctuating wildly, responded a servitor that spoke for the brain in jar that was the highest-ranking Mechanicus representative on the bridge. And we are getting signs of damage across the entire structure. It is our belief that the heretic's vile blasphemy will not be able to fire again without months of repairs, even if it manages to avoid self-destructing in the coming hours as a result of the Omnissiah's wrath for their heresy. Your calculations better be correct, Margus. Fleet report? She asked, turning to her first lieutenant. The man was, for all intents and purposes, the true captain of the Perseus, commanding the ship while she focused on her responsibilities as admiral.
But it was Navy protocol that an admiral be in command of a vessel, even if that position was largely ceremonial until things had gotten really wrong for the fleet, in which case Rebecca wasn't certain the admiral should still be in charge anyway. Regardless of her personal opinion, First Lieutenant Nero Lurias was one of the finest Navy officers she had ever had under her command, and he was more than up to the task of directing the enormous battleship. "Morale across the fleet has taken a hit, ma'am, no two ways about it," he replied without missing a beat. "The destruction of Beranos V has shaken the crews, and the techno-horrors reinforced that. Executions and speeches are doing the job, though, not a single mutiny reported across the Armada, and performance levels are expected to return to normal for all ships within 3.7 minutes, long before we reach the edge of the enemy's fire envelopes. With the Ordosh presence in that fleet, even the Ratlings wouldn't be that stupid," the Lady Admiral scowled. Proving once and for all that the God Emperor not only listened to his servants, but also had a wicked sense of humor, the entrance of the bridge opened at that exact moment, and the guards on station saluted as Inquisitor Galarian briskly walked in. Even the elite troopers were nervous at the presence of an Inquisitor, something Rebecca could hardly blame them for. Inquisitors were figures of dread for all within the Imperium. To not fear them was perhaps the greatest proof of disloyalty, heresy and stupidity conceivable. Not that Inquisitor Galarian wouldn't have been an intimidating sight even without the crimson rosette hanging from her neck. It was whispered behind her back that she could make children cry and heretics scream at the sight of her, and Rebecca wasn't willing to dismiss the claim out of hand. She was tall, made taller by the suit of power armor she wore. Rebecca had not seen her without it since she had boarded the Perseus as representative of the Ordosh involvement in the Retribution effort. Her skin was the color of night, and though her face was covered in scars, she either had avoided wounds requiring augmetics or those she had were so lifelike Rebecca couldn't spot the difference. An inactive power mace hung from her waist on her right, an ornate bolt pistol on her left, and a trio of servo skulls hovered around her like gruesome cherubims, each with a symbol emblazoned upon its forehead that, according to rumors, represented the sin for which the Inquisitor had executed their former owners. "I have received word from the planet," said the Inquisitor without preamble, coming to stand next to the Admiral's command throne. "Our enemy's scheme there has been thwarted. Thank you for sharing this information with me, Inquisitor." She had known the heretics were doing something on the system's sole inhabited world. The Inquisitor had wanted her to be ready to react at once if whatever the something was succeeded. But she hadn't been told any details. Given the many horrors that had been included in her briefing before the beginning of the campaign, she shuddered to imagine what it was the Inquisitor had judged lay beyond her clearance level. She was glad that particular threat had been averted, though she did wonder how the Inquisition had managed to deploy forces on Beranos 3 already, with the heretics' fleet in the way. "I didn't want you to be distracted, Lady Admiral. I expect you to do swift work of these heretics, so that we can liberate this system and continue our work in the rest of the sector." "Battle will begin soon," she replied. "It will be a tough fight, I won't deny it, but by the Emperor's grace we shall prevail." "Indeed we shall. There is another matter," the Inquisitor continued. "Under my authority, my men have taken custody of the pilots who survived the engagement. They have nothing to fear from us at this time," the Inquisitor added, and Rebecca was grateful of the courtesy. "But we need to know every detail about that particular brand of heresy they faced." "I understand," replied the Lady Admiral, and truly she did. She just hoped that whatever the Inquisitor's servants discovered didn't result in the execution of what remained of the 727th Fighter Wing. No sign of corruption had been reported when the few fighters had made it back to the landing bays, but that didn't mean the pilots were in the clear. Hopefully the Inquisitor wouldn't just order them all purged just to be safe. Rebecca forced her thoughts away from such a dangerous course and back to the matter at hand. Slowly, the fleet was coming back together, reforming as the last ships emerged from the asteroid field. The remaining 21 troop carriers were stationed at the back of the formation, guarded by a generous portion of the fleet's escorts, just in case the cyborgs followed to strike them from behind. The vessels of the Red Hunters and the Purple Stars were in the lead, designed by the Mechonicus to move more swiftly than their Navy counterparts in exchange for diminished firepower. Rebecca would always prefer the Imperial Navy's designs, but she still had to admit that the Space Marines' ships were a magnificent sight. The two chapters had brought a total of 8 ships, a not inconsiderable portion of their fighting strength.
The Rent Hunter's colors were on display on a battle barge, a strike cruiser, and 3 escort ships, while the Purple Stars had 3 strike cruisers of their own, their escorts having been destroyed in the campaign they had been fighting before the call to Azeroth. Behind the Space Marines came the bulk of the armada. Over a quarter of Battlefleet Econta was present, supplemented by the rogue trader vessels that some Inquisitors had commandeered prior to the muster. If not for the fact that every such vessel counted an inquisitorial presence aboard, Rebecca wouldn't have been willing to rely upon the mettle of these independent captains. They were famous for putting profit above duty, and in a war such as this one that made for poor allies. The Adeptus Mechanicus contribution was glaring by its absence. The disciples of the Omnissiah had refused to send forces along the first wave, citing the ancient treaties of mutual alliances that bound them to the forge worlds of the Zetherian system. Rebecca would have thought such treaties meant that the Cogboys had to send reinforcements, but apparently the interpretation of the Archmagi of Econta was that they had to save their strength, and only send their ships and armies once passage to Azeroth had been secured by the rest of the Imperium. She had been given to understand that there had been words exchanged between the Archmagi and the Imperial powers that be behind the swift gathering of the Armada, but they had remained inflexible. Not that the Adeptus Mechanicus would be alone in joining the war for Azeroth later. The rest of Battlefleet Econta was already mobilizing when they had left, gathering all but the barest contingent necessary to keep the Econta sector safe while the rest of the fleet went to liberate its neighbor from the horrors of chaos. While the Imperial Armada was reassuming its formation, the enemy host was coming at them like an undisciplined horde. Over 200 ships sailed ahead of the foe's cruisers, a fleet of converted civilian ships. Their reactors had clearly been tempered with, and strange weapons had been installed on their hulks. According to the tech priests, these modifications left almost no power for the void shields of these ships, some of which were little more than gargantuan troop transports who had discharged their cargo upon Beranos 3 before being turned against the Imperial fleet. I wonder if those heretics on Beranos realize that their only way off that world is being sent out to die? Rebecca mused. Her hands tightened around the armrests of her command throne as she thought that they likely wouldn't care even if they did. The Lady Admiral had faced the cultists of the ruinous powers before, and though the raiders she had obliterated had been insignificant compared to the storm of malice that had engulfed Azeroth, they had displayed a complete lack of concern for their lives that had chilled the then captain. "They outnumber us 4 to 1, Lady Admiral," noted Nero. For all the tension in his voice, the first lieutenant could as well have been talking about the last report from the tech priests about the amount of blessed screws they still had in their inventory. Rebecca smiled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. No matter how nervous she may be, she had to keep it hidden from the rest of the crew. Gossip spread faster than astropathic communication, and if she gave any hint of fear the already shaky morale of the fleet would crumble. "Then maybe these degenerate will offer us a challenge after all," she answered, her words echoing across the bridge. Spines straightened, and resolve filled those who had been, if not fearful, then nervous. 6 minutes to contact, called out one of the bridge servitors in its monotone voice. "Get me a link to the entire fleet," she commanded, and despite the ongoing repairs and the frantic work to put the fleet into a passable formation, it only took a few seconds for her will to be done. "This is Lady Admiral Delbaranthea, speaking to the Retribution fleet of the Econta sector. Before us is arrayed the might of the arch-enemy, who seeks to steal what belongs to him on Earth. Through sorcery and heresy they have sought to break us, because they know, in their black hearts, that they cannot hope to defeat us in honest, open battle. But their petty tricks will not save them, for all the might they wield is as nothing compared to the wrath of the God Emperor." She paused. "You may fire when ready," she added. "And know that the Emperor smile upon us, for today we do his work. O great ones, we beseech you, hear our prayer." The Doomborn had once been a grain barge, transporting the production of agri-worlds to the other planets of the Azeroth sector that required a constant import of foodstuffs to survive. It had been captured by the Unbound host on their way to Beranos, its crew slaughtered by a boarding party of Unbound and replaced with the cultists who now occupied it. Now it sailed directly into the teeth of the Imperial Armada, even as many other such ships around it burned and died, destroyed by the methodical fire of the Imperial Navy and its allies. "O Lords of the Dark, O blessed ones, though we are but maggots in your eyes, we implore you to grant us your blessing." Only one voice rose on the Doomborn's bridge, for all others had been silenced long ago.
The cultists of the Redeemed ritually severed their own tongues as part of their initiation, so that the only words spoken were those exalting the gods. The 23 skeleton crew on the bridge communicated with hand signals and through the machines of their station instead. Thankfully, there had never been a need for complex maneuvers, not that the largely untrained cultists could have pulled those off even had they been able to speak. Though we are unworthy of even the smallest speck of your attention, by fire do we make holy war upon your enemies, the slaves of the corpse god. The speaker was the sole priest of the Redeemed aboard the Doomborn, the only one of them who had been allowed to keep his tongue so that he may speak the words of dedication and sacrifice. He stood where the captain's chair had once been, long since removed along with the bloody remains of its last occupant. Like all of the Redeemed, he had been part of the Imperial Navy force that had first met the Black Crusade at Silberstadt. After being taken prisoner, he had his eyes opened by the dark priests among the Forsaken Sons, made to witness a fraction of the primordial truth. Even that limited revelation had been enough to drive him mad, and the priests had rebuilt his shattered psyche into something like theirs. They had seen something in him, some glimmer of worthiness, and so he had been allowed to keep his tongue and learn the sacred hymns and litanies. He had lost everything else, including the memory of his name. We commend our souls to you, as all must be in the end. We offer you our blood, our toil, and ask only that you accept this paltry sacrifice to your infinite glory. There were hundreds of Redeemed scattered across the fleet, with even more among the other forces of the Black Crusade. The Forsaken Sons had left Silberstadt a graveyard, but there had been plenty of flesh to plunder along with the ships seized by Chaos Marines boarding parties. Of the thousands who had been taken then, less than a tenth had been assigned to the unbound host, who did not lack in mortal fodder. Blessed Karalit, the Lord of Ash, had refined the process of breaking a mortal's will to an art form, and shared his teachings with those of the Forsaken Sons who were of similar inclination before departing to attend his own duties. What had been used on the Redeemed was as crude as it was cruel, and had left only part of their former skills intact, but that was enough for the Doomborn's purpose. By this fire, we give ourselves unto you, that our miserable lives may find purpose in your cause. Along with hundreds of converted civilian vessels, the Doomborn was sailing ahead of the unbound host's real fleet. Its engines were burning hot, too hot, driven into overdrive by dark mechanicum modifications and the sacrifice of 13 souls to the plasma reactor. The sacrifices had not been redeemed, they had been captives taken from Beranos 3 and dragged in chains across the ships of the first wave for that exact purpose. On dozens of vessels, thousands had been bled over engines pulsating with warp light, feeding their lives and souls to the infernal principles by which they operated. Now these engines were providing one final burst of acceleration, closing the distance between them and the enemy even as the metal bones of the ships cracked and bent, unable to withstand the forces coursing through them. Let the will of the gods be done. The hulls of the Doomborn, filled with explosives where they had once contained grain, detonated with the strength of a Nova cannon's shell. The shields of the 3 Imperial vessels caught in the blast buckled and strained before bursting. Dozens of other ships also exploded, their crews consumed in one final tribute to the ruinous powers. For the dark gods were creatures of war one and all, and nowhere were they more honored by the followers' offerings than when those took place on the battlefield. The vanguard of the Imperial fleet was crippled, even though no ship was outright destroyed. With their shields overloaded, their power cores suffered from catastrophic feedback, leaving them twisting impotently in the void as the second wave of the Chaos fleet slipped between them. Rebecca swore silently as she saw the first enemy ships detonate, immediately followed by dozens more, punching holes inside her formation by disabling her vanguard. She had thought the weapons slapped on the hulls of the enemy first wave were the heretics' attempt at getting the most use out of captured civilian vessels, and doubtlessly they had also been that. But precisely because these additions had been unstable piles of blasphemous technology, they must have been very easy to convert into giant bombs. Fire ships, she thought. The entire first wave was made up of fire ships. It was insanity. Rebecca had encountered fire ships before, but those had been captured merchant vessels, used by pirates to bait Imperial patrols and cripple them before striking from ambush. The enemy had sacrificed over 100 ships and their crew to this suicide tactic, and due to the enormous distances of space combat, they hadn't destroyed a single one of hers in exchange, only created an opening that the other ships could take advantage of. If an Imperial admiral had used tactics like these, The commissars would have had him executed before the hour was done for wasting the lives of the Emperor's servants and, more importantly, the ships of his navy.
But that's the thing, isn't it?
We aren't facing Imperials, or even raiders and pirates. She had thought, however subconsciously, that the enemy would behave sensibly. That they would seek to husband their forces in preparation for the long and bloody war that would consume the Azeroth sector, for the next wave of Imperial retribution that even now gathered in the rest of the segmentum. She had underestimated the depths to which the archenemy was willing to sink, the sacrifices it was willing to make for immediate gain, and it might cost them the entire first wave of the Reclamation Crusade. "Get me the damage on the ships caught in the blast radius," she ordered, "and an estimation of how soon they will be back online." "On it, ma'am," answered Nero, calm and professional as ever. The two of them had spoken loudly enough to be heard on the entire bridge, and their exchange was like a whip to the back of the shocked bridge crew. Within moments, a list of compiled Auspex reports began to flow on her command station. This wasn't good. The Space Marines had been crippled, left to float in the void with their shields down and their engines overloaded. Already the second wave of the foe was passing between them, aimed straight at the second line of the Imperial fleet. "Lady Admiral," came the voice from her side. "A moment, if you please." She turned toward the Inquisitor, raising an eyebrow to convey that now was not the time to disturb her without outright saying it. Gallarine looked just as grim as she had before, but, Rebecca noticed, she did not appear surprised by this sudden turn of events. "I understand that you may be troubled by this recent development," she said, an understatement if there ever was one. Then, to Rebecca's shock, the woman actually smiled. "But keep faith. Our situation is not as dire as it may seem. The God Emperor watches over us, and in this instance, he intervened more directly than he typically does." Rebecca looked at the Inquisitor, someone she knew could have her killed at any moment if she judged it either necessary or deserved. Her face remained neutral, while her thoughts spinned furiously. She was Lady Admiral of the fleet, and while there were others in the gathered armada whose positions offered them greater influence in the Imperium, such as the chapter masters of the Space Marines, or the generals of the Imperial Guard regiments in the transports, this was a void battle, and in those things her authority should be unquestioned. Yet she also knew that there were aspects of this war she did not know, and shouldn't know. The speed of this fleet's gathering, the presence of 2 Space Marine chapters and so many Inquisitors, had been proof enough of that. So she didn't press and ask the Inquisitor what she knew, for that path led to either refusal, punishment, or knowledge she was confident she was better without. "What can you tell me?" she said instead, softly, just as Gallarine had, so that none others could hear them over the din of the bridge's activity. "The archenemy will seek to board us," replied the Inquisitor, "to bring the fullness of their horrendous strength to bear against us, because they know they cannot defeat you in a clash of ships. We both knew this would be their intent, and you sought to prevent it by sending the Astartes forward, as was your duty. But me and mine?" She smiled again, and Rebecca shivered. "We knew that boarding actions were inevitable, and so we took precautions." If the Inquisitor had intended that to be reassuring, Rebecca thought, she hadn't quite succeeded. Morkoth's smile widened as he saw the void lit up with the detonation of his first, sacrificial wave. Many of the fire ships had been destroyed before reaching their appointed positions, as he had known they would, and the damage those who hadn't been enough to destroy any enemy ships. But it didn't matter. The path was open, and those ships who had been caught in his trap were drifting in the void, defenseless. "All ships, full speed ahead," he commanded. "On my signal, unleash the first wave of torpedoes, with focus on cruiser-class ships and above. Balance of virtue, take your pack and break through their lines, get to their transports and gut them. Negator, Tiarelian, follow the flagship and keep the Navy's second line occupied." He did not bother giving orders to the rest of the chaff. Now that blood and fire had been spilled, the madmen and cultists they had put inside them would not be in any state to follow a coherent strategy. That was fine. Their sole purpose was to keep the enemy guns occupied, and inflict as many deaths of 1,000 cuts as possible with their dark mechanicum weapons. The Chaos Fleet rushed forward, lances blazing as the cruisers opened fire on vulnerable foes. Like a knife to the gut after punching an opponent into the head to stun him, the ships of the Forsaken Sons had pierced the Imperial formation, and unleashed the full wrath of their armaments. One by one, The stressed void shields of Imperial ships collapsed, and their point defenses were overwhelmed as wave after wave of torpedoes slammed into their hulls. Some were destroyed outright, as a lucky shot found a munition depot, or simply because too many shallow cuts could still kill even a Leviathan of the Void. It would be soon, Morkoth could feel it. That moment when they would have to send their boarding parties in order to reach their targets before the first shields were raised again. The more he delayed, the more damage the enemy ships took and the more boarding parties would make it without being blasted apart, but if he waited too long, they would lose everything. Half through instinct, half through stolen memories, and with a generous helping of the Blade's shared infernal senses, the fleet master of the Unbound sensed the moment arrive, and gave the order. "Now," he growled. "All forces, mark your targets and launch boarding actions. Make the slaves of the corpse god bleed. For the Awakened One and the Unbound host, break them." From the armada of the Unbound host, hundreds of drop pods, boarding torpedoes and gunships burst forth, carrying within them the monsters that had been forged in the crucible of the Wailing Storm and their slaves. On every Imperial ships, Vox speakers disgorged the sound of blood oaths and the screams of the damned before their officers shut them down. Still some of the carriers were destroyed, the lives of those within snuffed out before they had time to realize their doom. Dozens of Unbound and hundreds of slaves perished before having spilled a single drop of Imperial blood. But many, many more reached their prey, as their transports smashed through hull plates or crash-landed into open bays amidst the remnants of the Imperial Armada's fighter wings. From boarding torpedoes and ramshackle gunships emerged the progeny of the Fleshmasters, drunk on the promise of slaughter to come, and on the other side of an ever-thinning veil, vast and monstrous powers laughed. "Prepare to repel boarders." To the crew of the Golden Ember, these 4 words heralded the coming of death. Since being commandeered by the Inquisition to join the Retribution fleet bound for the Azarok sector, the thousands of lowly menials dwelling in the underdecks of the rogue trader vessel had lived in fear of that moment. Shipping forces rarely went this far from the bridge, guns and engineering decks, and rumors about what they would face in Azarok had run unchecked. When word had filtered down that the enemy had destroyed a world in a single blow, it had been like pouring promethium on an open flame. Only the fear of the Inquisitor aboard had kept them from rioting. Instead, they had bunkered down into makeshift shelters, sealing heavy doors behind them and praying for safety. The household troops sworn to the Birimbak line, whose members had captained the Ember since the Scouring, would not protect them. They were focused on defending the important areas of the ship, not the redundant systems and the masses crewing them. This went against the instructions that had been sent to the Golden Ember. As the ship fumbled her way out of the asteroid field, several messages had been sent telling her shipmaster to send troops to the lower decks. Unfortunately, the Golden Ember's Vox master was dead, his brain having fried when an unlucky blow to the hull had shattered the ship's Vox array and sent feedback throughout the entire system. But since these new orders hadn't included any updates regarding the Ember's positioning in the Imperial Armada, Fleet Command hadn't noticed anything wrong. It wasn't like the rogue trader vessel was the only one who had been unable to respond to the hails. A small thing, but one that would see the Golden Ember and every single one of the 30,000 souls aboard her doomed. 6 projectiles hit the belly of the Golden Ember. Crafted in great numbers by the Dark Mechanicum, these were cheap, single-use torpedoes with a metal-devouring construct at the tip to dig their way through the hull of enemy vessels. From them emerged the flayed ones, Unbound for whom the gene-forging process had gone horribly wrong, but not quite wrong enough to warrant the mercy of a quick execution. As their name indicated, the flayed were skinless. Plates of metal had been hammered over their raw, bulging muscles. There was no way for them to wear standard power armor over their deformities, and they had been implanted with injectors whose drugs helped keep their perpetual torment manageable. Not that it did much for their sanity. The flayed were all completely insane, the result of another corner too many cut by the Fleshmaster who had directed their ascension. They were consumed by a desire to inflict their pain upon their surroundings, which made them a threat to any who did not share their condition. Controlling them in battle was a fool's errand. They could, however, be aimed at the enemy and let loose with a set of cursed weapons in their hands, which was what Morkoth had done. 29 flayed emerged from the wreckage, holding weapons within which the Coven had bound lesser demons of Khorne, and began to hunt. The Neverborn within their blades guided them toward the crew's hiding places, and the demon weapons cut through the reinforced doors in moments, letting the monsters in among the horrified mortals. Blood and terror flowed, and the bound demons drank deep from both, until, as expected by the Flayed's masters, their infernal power eroded the shoddy wards that had kept them contained. The Neverborn broke free, empowered by the slaughter of thousands, and made bodies for themselves out of the dead mortals and the Flayed who had wielded them. Then they turned on each other, devouring one another's power and stolen flesh, until only one remained, swollen far beyond its humble origins, but still hungering for more, always more, as was ever the wont of the Neverborn. The first glimpse that the Ember's household troops caught of the enemy was enough to turn half of them insane. A monstrosity of bone, blood and skinless flesh rose from the lower decks, destroying all in its ways, drawn to the bridge whether by the promise of more souls to send to Khorne or by some lingering instinct engraved in the genetic memory of the Flayed it had consumed. Those who retained their wits fired ineffectively at the abomination, before being dragged by thorny tentacles into mouths filled with rows upon rows of human teeth. Cale Birinbark, current holder of his bloodline's warrant of trade, was on the bridge when it was breached. It had been many years since the rogue trader had last taken part in a fight himself, the days of his youth were long since spent. But he still met the horror with sword and pistol in hand, though it availed him nothing before he was torn to pieces and devoured by the abomination. Mercifully, the horror of the Golden Ember's crew ended before the demon could claim the bridge and seize control over the entire ship, turning the venerable vessel into a brand new demon ship. As the screams of the crew spread across the warp, orders were sent to the ships surrounding the rogue trader vessel, and it was blasted to pieces, and the pieces fired upon again and again, until nothing was left but molten slag, to prevent any trace of the corruption from remaining. But though the worst had been averted, the ship had still been lost, the balance still shifted ever so slightly in the heretic's favor. Brother Carius of the Red Hunter's Third Company had wondered why he was here, on the bridge of the battleship Bellerophon. Not here in the Azeroth sector, of course. The officers of the chapter had made sure to share the intelligence they had received on the fallen sector's fate with the rank and file. And he knew why they were in the Beranos system too. The overly simplified star maps were clear that this was the only direct path between the Econta and Azeroth sector. Once this system was claimed and the taint of the heretics purged with Bolter and Blade, the next wave of the Reclamation forces would be able to use the several warp routes that led from Beranos deeper into Azeroth. Taking this galactic choke point would be hard and bloody work, but there was honor in doing this, in being the first into the breach against so despicable a foe. The archenemy had made Azeroth bleed, and for that sin the Red Hunters would visit upon them the Emperor's judgment. Of this, there was no question. No, instead Carius had wondered why he was aboard the Bellerophon, standing on her bridge as her officers made war with enemies tens of thousands of kilometers distant. He had thought that he should be aboard his company's strike cruiser, the Banner of Fury, preparing to bring the fight to the enemies of the Golden Throne. Indeed, such had been his squad's initial assignment. But as the fleet had pulled itself out of the arch-enemy's planet-shattering trap, new orders had arrived from the captain of the Third Company. Like half the company, Carius and his squad had been redeployed, their transport taking them to the Bellerophon while the rest of the fleet was still struggling to return in formation. By order of the captain, half the squad was to go to the bridge and the other to the engineerium, in order to lend their aid to the battleship's defense. He had obeyed, of course, for that was what a space marine did. But the thought that while he stood guard his brothers would fight in the very teeth of the foe sat ill with him. The Bellerophon was a leviathan of a ship, her armaments designed to unleash death from afar, not to slug it out with the enemy in what passed for close quarters in space engagements. There would be no boarding action launched from here, and from the formation he could see on the screens it was highly unlikely the enemy would break through the battleship's escorts and deploy boarders of their own. His squad's deployment had felt like a waste. But his captain would not have relinquished his warriors without cause. Even as Carius and his brothers moved out of the Banner of Fury, so too had half the company, sent piecemeal to other vessels across the fleet. And so Carius had remained silent, and wondered what it was he had missed. Now, with his blade clashing against the shrieking chain axe wielded by a grotesque parody of a space marine, he didn't need to wonder anymore. The entire first line of the armada had been crippled by the detonation of the fire ships. Carius had seen it happen on the Bellerophon's Auspex screens, watching in cold horror as the 5 ships his chapter had brought to the crusade were knocked out, their shields overloaded by the series of self-detonations. The Chaos cruisers had sailed right past them, and what seemed to be their flagship, an abomination that was as much demon as it was metal, had unleashed its weapons upon the Bellerophon, crippling her shields before letting loose a tide of boarding torpedoes that had slammed into her hull and disgorged their lethal cargo into her belly. The Imperial Navy enforcers had done their best to stop the boarders, assisted by the soldiers of the Gerusian 158th Regiment who had been brought to Azeroth aboard the battleship. By all accounts, the mortals had fought well, but some of the foe had still torn through them and made it to the bridge, where they had found Carius and his half-squad waiting for them. The warrior in front of Carius resembled a space marine in the same way a Mechonicus servitor resembled a man. It wore a suit of black power armor that left its arms bare, the muscles bulging in unnatural fashion under the scarred and branded skin. It was covered in the blood of those he had slain to come here, but Carius could see older stains beneath the fresh ones. "What?" growled the Red Hunter as he strained against the Chaos Marine's monstrous strength. "Are you your replacements?" It rasped back through its horned helmet's vox grill. "Mankind's new masters. The Unbound." "There is only one master of mankind," Carius said between gritted teeth. "And in his name, you will die here this day." It laughed at him, the sound broken and deranged, and kicked him in the leg. His balance broken, Carius stumbled, but before the Chaos Marine could take advantage he bent down, leaning into the fall as he came to one knee while letting go of his sword with one hand. His knee hit the deck and the chain axe bit into his armor, but he had turned the blow aside just enough that it found his shoulder instead of his skull, and with not enough strength to sever the appendage. Then, with his free hand, he drew his bolt pistol and rammed it into the heretic's chin before pulling the trigger, turning its head into red mist. With a grunt, Carius pushed himself back up, sending the headless corpse tumbling down with a push, tearing the chain axe out of his shoulder as he did so. The roving teeth had reached his flesh, but the limb was still functional. Good. It wouldn't do to be taken out of the fight before the actual battle for Beranos had even begun. Silence was falling on the bridge as the last of the Chaos Marines was being put down. The Red Hunters had managed to keep the bridge crew safe, but more than 2/3 of the bridge human security troops had perished, and all of Carius' brothers bore some wounds. "This is Carius," he called out over the vox. "Bridge is secure." "This is David," came the reply from the squad sergeant. "Engineerium is secure." Carius allowed himself a breath of relief. With the main thrusts of the enemy defeated, the Bellerophon was safe for the time being, though there was still work to be done purging the remains of the foe that had fled. Still, he wondered, how had the captain known to send him and his squad here, on that particular ship? If they had not been here, these Unbound would have torn through the bridge and likely the Engineerium as well, either destroying the Bellerophon or, worse, turning her against the rest of the fleet. Unknown to Brother Carius, the same scene was being repeated across several ships of the Imperial Armada, as warriors of the Red Hunters and Purple Stars who had been removed from their chapters' vessels fought Unbound boarders. No longer smiling, Morkoth clicked his tongue in displeasure, and the Blade of Terror shuddered in sympathy. Though the void battle was still unfolding, its conclusion was already written for those who knew how to look. Not enough of the boarding parties had succeeded to disrupt the Imperials' formation. Reports from those Unbound disciplined enough to send information up the chain of command had revealed Space Marines had been deployed on several targets. Given that those had been chosen at the last moment, there was only one possible cause for their presence: sorcery. Somehow, the Imperials had known those ships would be boarded, and sacrificed the deployment of these Space Marines as boarders of their own to defend their vessels instead. Not all boarded ships had been reinforced by the Angels of Death, but even on the others there was more resistance than anticipated. From the beginning, Morkoth had known the only way to win this battle had been to break the enemy formation, to shatter their discipline and spread terror across their ranks. His fleet was a gang of killers, whereas the foe's was a disciplined, regimented army with a few unruly auxiliaries. The whole point of blowing up Beranos V and sacrificing a not inconsiderable portion of his fleet as fire ships had been to engineer such a collapse, repeated blows to morale, inflicted with ruthlessness and through eldritch means, enough to make even the blind sheep of the Imperium falter. And it hadn't worked. Oh, the Imperials would bleed for a while yet. The Unbound would exact a terrible price before being put down. But unless a miracle occurred in the next few hours, eventually the Chaos Fleet would be crushed. "Do we have word from Julius?" Another shot of the Shiva's wrath may just be the miracle they needed, though aiming it to minimize casualties on their side would be tricky. "Nothing,"
"Lord," came the reply, the mortal not quite managing to hide his fear at delivering ill news. Morkoth ignored him. Only a fool would have taken out his wrath on his own officers while a battle was raging. It had been a long shot anyway. The fleet master looked at the image of the battle, trying to think of an approach that may yet turn the tide. Memories not his own flickered at the edge of his awareness, the memories of the legionaries whose blood had been made to flow through his veins during ascension, as well as those of the captured Imperial Navy officers whose brains he had devoured after the Battle of Silberstadt. But all those tactics were dependent on having a fleet that would obey instructions, and he did not have that, so instead he focused on what he had learned for himself during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. With his eyes closed, Morkoth called upon his eidetic memory, recalling the previous engagements he had fought. He thought of the Battle of Grey Ash, when the Unbound had fought the long-dead ships of an Imperial Navy flotilla, bustling with the ghosts of their former crew. Of the weeks-long hunt they had waged amidst the sevenfold nebulas, pursuing void beasts that had been strange before the warp had gotten to them. Of the orbit of Nemelia III, where they had defeated a gathering of pirates and raiders 10 times their strength by shattering the tenuous alliances between rival warlords. Of Wadagesh, whose fighter wings had taken 3 months to destroy amidst that system's outer rings, their pilots wired to their machinery and driven beyond fear and mortal needs by the chems running through their veins. He thought back on every void battle he had ever fought, and he found nothing. There was no way for him to turn this around. Unless there was one option left. The Blade of Terror was far faster than a vessel its size, and more resilient besides. If he gave the order to the rest of the fleet to clear a path, he could take his ship into the heart of the enemy formation, aim it like its namesake directly at the far larger Perseus, the battleship that Vox Interceptors had confirmed was the flagship of the Imperial Armada. His gauntleted hands tightened into fists. It could be done, he thought. How long had it been since he had spilled blood in person? He could join the borders. How glorious would it feel, to rip out the heart of the one who had outmaneuvered him, to devour it before their eyes before feasting upon their brains and adding their knowledge to his own. No. He crushed the temptation out of his mind, before reaching through his connection to the blade and lashing out at the demonic spirit. It had been behind that foolish idea, hungry as it ever was to spill blood and fire into the void. But the demon ship didn't exactly have a concept of its own mortality. It was too limited to really understand such a move would see them all dead even if it worked. Morkoth did not fear death, but neither was he willing to throw his life away. Especially when his orders ran to the contrary. The fleet master sighed, and leaned back into his command throne. "This round goes to you," he whispered, unheard by any save the ship itself. In a louder tone, he called out, "Send messages to the Balance of Virtue, the Negator and the Tiarelian. Their unbound contingents are to return home as soon as they have completed their current operations, and the ships are to disengage immediately after. Then prepare for our own withdrawal." There was a pause, as the crew digested his words. "Do it," he snarled, and they jerked back into activity. He couldn't really blame them for their surprise. The withdrawal may have been Malone's instructions if things turned against them, but Morkoth hadn't shared them with anyone in the fleet. In order for them to have any chance of victory, there could be no hesitation, no holding back in the hope of being still alive to join the retreat. "Contact the Eidolon of Regrets and the Daggers as well," he added, almost as an afterthought. "We will meet up with them in orbit of Beranos III and decide on our next course of action." "My lord, the Negator and the Tiarelian are responding. They still have most of their unbound contingent deployed aboard enemy ships. Tell them that if they can't disengage within 10 minutes, they are to leave them behind," he commanded brutally. "These warriors aren't worth risking the ships." As the Blade of Terror and its crew moved to follow his orders, Morkoth stared at the image of the enemy flagship on the bridge's fleshy hololith equivalent. "You did not earn this victory," he thought to himself. "And you will yet pay for that." Aboard the battle barge Fire of Dawn, the warrior who was known to his brethren only as Janus opened his eyes. He had spent the last hours in meditation, casting his mind beyond the boundaries of his flesh in the corridors of the venerable battle barge, sensing the ebb and flow of the battle raging beyond. It was done. Though ships still burned and died, any chance of the battle turning against them had passed. The enemy commander had withdrawn, abandoning the bulk of his fleet to be slaughtered. Some would seek to escape, those whose crews were not too deeply enthralled by fear or madness. And some would succeed, despite the Lady Admiral's best efforts.
Those who did not rejoin the Black Crusade's other forces would be a plague upon the region for decades to come. Janus could see this, as clearly as he had seen which ships needed to be reinforced for the Imperial formation to hold. His predictions hadn't been perfect, they never could be, and to even attempt it was to court perdition, but they had helped secure what would otherwise have been a very close battle. With the Chaos Fleet broken, the Imperial forces would be able to make Planet fall, and purge Beranos III from the heretics who now held it. But no Grey Knight would fight in that campaign, however righteous. Already the ships of the chapter were parting from the Imperial Armada, still hidden from the auspexes of those they had secretly accompanied. In front of the kneeling chapter master, on a table carved from wood from one of Terra's last trees, laid 5 crystal cards. Since leaving Titan, Janus had consulted the tarot many times. He had always drawn the same cards, marking the dooms that grew within Azeroth. The Hierophant, the Tower, the Devil, the Chariot, the Magician. Not since the heresy had so many evils been unleashed at once by the servants of chaos. Even the Black Crusades of Abaddon had been little more than a collection of raids, masking the true intent of the Sons of Horus' first captain. And yet all of these were but lesser threats compared to the one that had driven him to depart from Titan, and that the last communique from Lord Inquisitor Ackerman had finally named. The Nightmare Fleet. Having a name to put on the shapeless visions of rising darkness had helped clear his second sight. The chapter master of the Grey Knights could see it now, when he closed his eyes and cast his mind down paths he had first learned to thread beneath the sun of a world whose name was now forbidden within the Imperium. Raiwe Noara, the Eldar called it. The name was written into the tapestry of fate, surrounded by the flames of ruin. An old sin, sealed away but never expunged, never atoned for. Did the Chaos Lord Archon understand what it was he sought to unleash? Most likely, yes. Long gone were the days when Janus had believed there were limits to the horrors men would willingly inflict upon one another. He did not doubt that the Awakened One also thought he could control, or at least direct the Nightmare Fleet. And perhaps he could, but that was irrelevant. Janus could not, would not, let it come to that. The evils of Old Night would remain locked away, and Archon's plan, whatever it was, would come to nothing. This was the reason why he had left Titan. But while the Nightmare Fleet was the greatest threat of this Black Crusade, the lesser dooms revealed by the Tarot could not be ignored either. It was Janus' belief that Archon had engineered these catastrophes in order to muddle the tides of fate, the better to hide his ultimate purpose from scrying. Of course, the Awakened One would reap the benefits of these plots all the same should they succeed. They would not have been nearly as effective in disturbing the Grey Knight's oracular abilities if they hadn't been real. Janus had consulted the archives, when the name of Archon had been carried to the Grey Knights on the etheric tides. In the wake of heresy, the Imperial records had been thoroughly purged by the Inquisition, who had sought to erase all knowledge of the traitor legions so that none would seek to replicate their rebellion or unleash them from their pit. But copies had been preserved, for the heirs of Malcador had known that knowledge was one of the most powerful weapons against the archenemy, if also one of the most dangerous to wield. The Crusade-era biography of Commander Archon of the Sons of Horus was recorded within the encrypted archives of the Fire of Dawn. Like most of the sons who had followed the Warmaster to rebellion, he had been born on Chthoniya, taken from the endlessly feuding underworld gangs that had ruled this bleak planet and made into a legionary to serve and die within the 16th. He had risen through the ranks, and had earned his mantle of commander, a rare title in the legions, but not one unheard of, when he had needed to lead 4 companies of the then recently renamed Sons of Horus in battle against an uprising in the Galactic West. A worthy history, but not one of any particular significance, which made it all the more chilling that such an otherwise unremarkable warlord had ended up rising to become one capable of unleashing such devastation upon Azeroth. There were other records, though. Fragmented pieces of information, about what the Awakened One had done in the Warmaster's service during the heresy. These were even more restricted, and even the archives of the Grey Knights had not escaped the Inquisition's purge. But Janus had been able to find enough pieces to form a very disturbing pictures. It was Janus' mission to kill Archon and end the threat to the Imperium he represented. But before he did so, the chapter master fully intended to extract from the Chaos Lord the truth of what he had done on Chthoniya. Not all sins could, or even should be expunged, but all should be remembered. After all,